Hello everyone, Omni Sensei here with What If I Were Reborn as a Vampire in the DC-verse, Part 3. If you enjoy this content, smash the like button. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description.
Life was full of surprises. John had planned to spend the last moments of the night, now extended thanks to his evolution, to get in some last-minute briefings. If Copperhead were to work for him, then he ought to make her a whole new identity, modify her appearance enough for her to stand by his side without rousing suspicion, and maybe even fake her death to get rid of possible issues. People who could make it happen were plentiful, and for someone with as many former criminals as his new employees, finding someone more or less reliable was an easy task. He would also need to lighten the now deceased hungry of his last possessions. Wasting precious resources wasn't his way after all. Then maybe get some paperwork done. Bloody hell, his life was boring. He really should get a personal assistant to deal with this paper-pushing bullshit. Larissa, however, had something different in mind. Bubs, you should probably... He started addressing his first ghoul, but couldn't finish his sentence as the assassin who just got a taste of power quite literally jumped at him. To say that he was surprised was an understatement. Both he and Reginald were about to get rid of the traitorous wench when her lips captured his own, changing the whole situation in one simple gesture. He groaned, but she was dead set on trying to asphyxiate a vampire, an exercise in futility if there ever was one. She should know better after their little fight. Her long, nimble legs slid around his waist and locked itself on his back, keeping her in place as if he were foolish enough to try and stop her. No, the correct course of action was tasting her lips and enjoying her toned muscles and feeling her flesh pressing against him, teasing him with every move. If there ever was a time to use the blush of life, it was this one. His hands reached out for her waist, sliding through the skin-tight fabric and seeking her bare flesh. His finger pressed on her back dimples and made her moan against his lips. Yet despite his fierce resistance, the killer wasn't about to abandon her target, her tongue brushing against his lips, trying to overcome him. Clang. He did not know when or how, but she somehow managed to remove those sharp, venomous metal claws attached to her wrists. Larissa casually dropped them on the floor and now used her barely less lethal hands to grab the back of his head and pull him even closer. It was brutish and violent and betrayed an utter lack of experience. John absolutely loved it. Overcoming his initial surprise, the vampire answered in kind, pulling at her flesh with barely enough restraint to avoid hurting her. He fought her kiss for kiss. No quarters were given. John lightly bit her lips, tasting the sweet aroma of her metahuman blood, tasting the result of years of training and suffering, years spent perfecting the dreadful art of murder for the benefit of people who saw her as nothing but a weapon to be used and discarded as they saw fit. Blood was life, and through her blood, through his own increased blood potency, he enjoyed a glimpse of things a fledgling's immature palate could hardly register. Moan! She whimpered against his lips, the pleasure and pain of the bite reminding her of why this John Harker, why this son of a Bruja was so dangerous. One moan after the other, their kiss became something more, something greater, more intense. I think I'd better get going, boss, Reginald said, looking more amused than disturbed by his master and fellow ghoul's proclivities. I'll make sure Hungry's place gets looted and the rest of his stash houses emptied before someone reports the murder. I'll also work out a deal with the ID guy for your lady friend. Thank you, Bubbles, John tried to say, but it came out more like a succession of groans and sounds so wet even Orochimaru would tell them to get a room. Reginald left, laughing at his master's way with the ladies, but a bit cautious about whether or not hooking up with girls who tried to kill him would become a habit. At least John kept things interesting. It sure beat working at Walmart. By Regie, John tried to say, raising a hand to wave at him, but it sadly came out as even more unholy sounds, and that hand was promptly stolen by Copperhead and guided to a place where it could be much, much more useful. Yes, unlife could indeed be the best thing ever. The next night, John woke up still holding the naked assassin, fondly remembering their many valiant battles. They fought in the living room for a while, first neither of them willing to lose ground, no matter the casualties. However, the skirmish soon moved to the bedroom, where they could be much wilder, giving in to their lusts. Lust for battle, of course. Then they fought in the kitchen, and to the bathroom again for a final stand that started under the shower and only ended with them still holding on to each other in bed, one of them fainting due to exhaustion and a severe lack of blood, and the other because he spent hours resisting the call of torpor during the day, something he couldn't even imagine doing before his maturation. Larissa's body was covered in bite marks, and the small amount of blood she ingested was already healing. Many more were made and disappeared as he licked them closed. This kind of pleasurable struggle would bring madness if done to his human blood dolls, but she took it valiantly. Nay, she initiated most of it herself. Truly an admirable warrior. Still, I better let her rest, he thought, covering her naked body with a blanket before pausing. Wait, would she feel bad if I left her like this? He thought about it, wondering if he was, in fact, the asshole, before concluding that if he came back before she could wake up and eat her out while having prepared some breakfast for her, then she couldn't possibly be dissatisfied with his behavior. A foolproof plan indeed. With what was left of his morality and standing as a gentleman secured, he left the room and closed the door, letting the woman paid to kill him rest after a very busy day. There was no way keeping her around would come back to bite him, right? He was the one who did the biting, after all. Whatever, John thought. Tomorrow's problems are for tomorrow me. Today's issues are plentiful enough as it is. Beyond the quotidian professional shit-eating known as paperwork, he still needed to figure out exactly what his new level of maturity as a neonate vampire meant. Understand the changes in the system interface and how it worked exactly, and see what he could do with blood manipulation. The whole guiding spilled blood from the air into his throat was a crude way of doing things, only useful because he was too fundamentally opposed to sinking his teeth into the necks of the unwashed masses. In the words of the noble Bubbles, that shit is gay. It's about time I tested the limits of my ability, was his ultimate conclusion. Now there was no need to slaughter his whole extended family to do that, but some parts might be more complicated than others. Testing his speed would be rather straightforward. Just get a Bubbles with a timer and measure how fast he could cross a certain distance with more or less blood buff boosting him, and compare it to the slightly enhanced Ghoul and the Olympic runners, and he should have a solid idea of where he stands on the totem pole. Lifting strength would work the same way, though his striking power would be more complicated. He would need to fight the hardest material he could physically destroy. What's next? Durability and regeneration. Guess I'll just ask Bubbles to shoot me, he thought, and he meant every word. Not knowing what he could do was a risk he was no longer willing to take. Still, he felt a bit strange. It might be due to the new heights he has reached, the growth in his abilities, and the way his skin felt tougher, his muscles stronger, and his body so much more resilient and powerful. Even his abilities like presence or dominance felt stronger somehow, as if he could affect people on a deeper level, not just the usual awe, intimidation, or calming effect, or those vague one-word orders limited to a single target, which he might resist or misinterpret. And yet, there was no change in the system interface. Even his reserves felt much deeper than what the system told him. Sigh. No use wasting my time thinking about it. I'd better call Reginald and prepare my little physical examination, he thought, cracking his neck as he reached out for his pager. What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. Dracula. Warehouses were such a lovely thing. Always abundant, empty of human presence, and ready to accommodate the needy crime rings, novice superhumans looking to test their power, and all sorts of freaky, dangerous, and very much illegal shenanigans that filled the more fantastic worlds. Need to set up a trap to eliminate that very handsome, extremely intelligent, not quite modest but oh so overwhelmingly powerful monster of man. Go check out a warehouse. Need a meeting place to exchange millions of dollars for some extraterrestrial weaponry. Sure as hell gotta happen in the warehouse. Need to see how far your new vampiric powers can take you? You bet there's an empty warehouse for that. Alright, boss. I'm ready when you are, Bubbles said, currently dressed in a tracksuit that made him look like an Albanian gangster with a bit too much melanin. 3, 2, 1. John Harker, who preferred wearing his usual black and gray clothes that helped him blend in the dark, said while holding a stopwatch, "Go." Reginald started running as fast as he could, his form a bit amateurish and tarnished by years spent on the streets. But that same experience running like a crackhead did wonders for his time. That and the magical blood he gave him every month. Mostly the magic blood. As soon as he reached a chalked-up line, John stopped the watch and wrote the time down. 14 seconds, not bad at all. John whistled in approval. That was a pretty good number. Batman was supposed to do it in 9 seconds, moving at a whopping 11 meters per second, fast enough to put fear into a criminal's heart. However, that was fictional data. Thinking that the rumblings of bored keyboard warriors were gospel would probably lead John to his final death. Neas. The man didn't even sweat as he came back in a light jog. "Your turn, boss. Pass me the watch." And so he did, putting himself into position and waiting for the countdown. 3. Using the blood buff wasn't required, since he wanted to know his base speed as a neonate vampire, someone with 100 years of blood potency running through his veins. 2. Though using it would show how far he could take the force multiplier, and his reserves would barely take a hit, 3,000 blood points was a whole lot of power. 3. Go. In the blink of an eye, he was already there. If not for Reginald's own enhanced reflexes, he wouldn't even be able to stop the timer at the right moment. Dag. A bit over 4 seconds, boss man. I'm pretty sure that's some sort of record. Reginald shouted in excitement, forgetting that he was talking to a vampire. A record? We're in a world where Barry Allen could run with a negative timer. Fat chance of that happening. He shook his head, still a bit worried about how insane things are in this new world of his. He could torment drug dealers all night long, but what could he do if someone like Flash or even worse, Zoom, decided to mess with him? What if he got off at the speed of light every time he touched a woman? That's gay as heck. His undead wiener would also probably fall off. He shivered at the thought, but continued this little workout to forget it. Lifting steel beams was as easy as it goes. Even lifting a 2-ton car only took some effort. He would probably be able to lift up to a good 10 tons without using his blood buff. "Can I test my striking strength on you?" he asked his faithful ghoul, who then looked at him as if he were a very special little boy. But that was probably John's imagination. "No way in hell," Reginald answered. Okay. John chuckled. "Wanna shoot me? Boss, are you insane?" "No more than usual." Well, at least he tried. He knew he could take low-caliber bullets without much difficulty, and even assault rifles needed some time before they could do any meaningful damage to his body. Damage that his regeneration could fix almost instantly, as long as he had enough blood in reserve. As for his own attacks, his untrained punches easily tore his enemy's flesh and broke their bones, even when he held back. More than once, he shattered a wall to make an entrance to terrify an unlucky drug dealer, all in the name of justice and aggressive capitalism. His biggest weakness was his lack of proper fighting skills and utter absence of experience outside a few brawls in his world. Anything here was so easy it was more a creative process than any sort of combat. Of course, that was only because his foes were all ordinary humans or street-level enemies at best. In other words, cannon fodder. Copperhead was the only exception, but even then, the matchup was utterly horrendous for her. Putting an assassin who relied on dealing a few poisonous strikes or choking her opponent to death against the one guy who was too dead to get poisoned or need to breathe. That was hardly fair. With a few interesting thoughts in mind, John and his ghoul went their separate ways, the latter given the grim task of dealing with his master's paperwork. Painful fate indeed. The vampire had better things to do, like finishing today's experiment by finding a few guinea pigs, volunteer test subjects who either didn't mind getting some heavy and pretty destructive amounts of presence and dominance thrown at them or were too terrified to oppose him. Maybe play around with that low-level blood manipulation if possible. A few hours and many inflicted physical and emotional traumas later, John was finally satisfied. All for the sake of science. His presence was still limited to awing, terrifying, or calming those who felt it, but the number of people he could target rose from a single person to a small crowd, without requiring more blood or attention than usual. His dominate ability also saw some change, now allowing him to cloud the memory of his target and make them forget the last few minutes. The power of an ugly bastard. He noted, somehow feeling that many a pervert wept at the unfairness of the world. Why do I have a rapist's skill set? He couldn't help but wonder. Such abilities truly were wasted on him. A true degenerate from his world could probably dominate the planet, not the whole universe, with only these two powers. He might also get decapitated by Wonder Woman because he thought that hentai logic was applicable here, but some would consider it a sacrifice worth making. Regardless of John's unwanted similarities with Gilderoy Lockhart, said improvements were still useful, allowing him to be a bit bolder without fearing for his identity to be revealed before he was ready to bend the knee and shove the vampiric lemons up its ass. A time that was coming ever closer, for he was growing stronger one night at a time. Vampire rule. When the author is back, don't question it and just enjoy the chapter. Alucard put the gun down. 79. That's how many men died that night as a direct result of the massacre in Red Hook. Most left the world in those dirty warehouses, surrounded by the bodies of their fellow gangbangers, both living and dead. Others cramped up in ambulances that arrived just a moment too late or passed away on Wayne-funded beds at the nearest emergency hospital. Their bodies pumped full of drugs harder and stronger than any package they worked on the streets. It was almost poetic. The police got busy, the people got scared, and the press in general got a professional orgasm that was only rivaled by the local security equipment and gun peddlers. For one night, the world cared about a bunch of dead street rats who only ever amounted to a statistic. A number on a paper that was passed around from the first time they got socially promoted because the schools were too overwhelmed to give a damn about some illiterate son of a junkie, if they even knew who their father was, that is. It was passed around from depressed teachers to perverted superintendents to corrupt directors to even more depressed social workers, who left it neglected for many years before being inevitably taken in by some sadistic cop who was all too happy to make an arrest and blow up the crime rate and police efficiency in one go so the mayor could make a speech and the commissioner keep his arse on a fancy chair. Their death was in a way, the peak of their existence, the moment when that damned paper was put in a folder that shall never be opened again, when all the citizens read about them and cared about them. For one night, and then it was all gone. The media were quick to call it a short but bloody conflict between local gangs led by maladjusted deviants. The police made some token arrests and sent a few more patrols to the area, just long enough for the journalists to snap some pictures and write a story about the efficiency of the GCPD. Less than a week later, twice as many people were killed in incidents, murders, and arsons. Underage people, students, and citizens who paid their taxes and walked their dogs said hi to the neighbor, and sure as hell didn't deserve to be, but graped by Victor Zash in his latest attempts at freeing life. People who deserved to be avenged. But that didn't matter to one self-proclaimed busted brunette who ran a bakery on the better part of town, lived in a condo she couldn't afford if she made twice as much in a month, had people who cleaned it for her, did her taxes, invested her savings, and made sure she never had to think twice about the future if it wasn't to plan a vacation. Her student loans were paid, her stock portfolio managed. She had a stock portfolio. That sentence alone should never be associated with someone who once finished 2 bottles of whiskey before going to school. Nor did she care about the way the most rotten, drug-ridden neighborhood in Gotham was plagued by a parasite who fancied himself a symbiote. A parasite that was dead set on turning things around for the better, pushing forward the economy one raid at a time, laundering money, running businesses, funding rehab, and forcing people to go there even if he had to warp their minds. Closing strip clubs, gentlemen's bars, and all sorts of fronts for players who were either scared off or too dead to care about their assets. She didn't care about how many junkies, criminals, and other outcasts were finding their way back into a society that was no longer that repulsed by them. The free showers, food, and clothes might have helped with that part. and the number 79 meant absolutely nothing to her formerly broke self. Not when it has been more than a month since she last saw the man who made all of this happen. But she couldn't complain and wouldn't complain. Not when he gave her this life. So she sat back on the most comfortable couch in the world, eating the expensive ice cream that didn't taste like cardboard, and watched Vicky Vale talk on the television without truly registering her words. Still, it would be nice to spend some time together. She sighed as the chocolatey goodness melted in her mouth. It reminded her of the first time they met, until she could no longer ignore the TV. That is, we've just received breaking news. The Joker has escaped Arkham Asylum. The pretty blonde girl looked utterly terrified, and Max would bet $100 that she was making the same face. The last time the Joker was out, he and his psychotic girlfriend ended up blowing up a school bus, robbing 2 sperm banks, and somehow killing someone in Nebraska without leaving the city. All in one night. She and everyone with a brain went stark raving mad when he was denied the death sentence yet another time, and was sent back to the loony bin so that he could get the help he desperately needs. They all knew he would break out again, but it was much easier not to think about it. It could be worse. He's the only one who broke out, and he might go into hiding for a while. Max tried that thing called optimism she heard about every so often, which in itself was a pretty good indicator of how bad the situation was getting. Breaking news tonight from Arkham Asylum. Reports have just come in that the Joker has truly escaped custody but has yet to leave the island. It's unclear exactly how he managed to get out, but only moments after the first alarm was raised, chaos erupted throughout the facility. Witnesses described the situation as all hell breaking loose, with explosions and power outages reported inside the asylum. It wasn't working too well. To that, Max could only say one thing. Crap. Vampire rule. Keep your friends close, but your blood bags closer. There is truly no rest for the wicked. John had to physically stop himself from cursing at everything and everyone involved in this mess up. The night had started well enough, with a minimal amount of paperwork and a maximum amount of blood extracted from an all-too-willing assassin. Copperhead was happy to unwind after taking care of a rather unruly up-and-coming drug lord who saw Brideshead being cleansed and thought he struck gold. Free real estate up for grabs. He came in strong with good packages and strong muscles and lasted no more than 30 minutes before someone with a quarter and some sense called Reginald and informed him of the situation. The man himself only needed half as much time to get a solid estimate of the enemy's numbers and inform his vampire liege. What followed was the quick decapitation of a growing criminal organization. The assassination of the boss and his lieutenants was so much easier than the looting of his meager estate. All in a single night's work. John was content. His blood reserves were full, and he was hemorrhaging less and less money to keep his legitimate business and human resources development activities going. The streets were talking less and less about the so-called monster as he took a step back from his midnight walks. It was for the better. That particular identity was starting to become a liability now that he secured Brideshead. It was also too close to both his public identity and vampiric nature. Something that just wouldn't do. It wouldn't take long for someone to realize that the monster of Brideshead had something to do with the upstart lad cleaning up that hellhole. And it would take even less time to understand that both he and the monster are never seen in the sun. It might be a bit paranoid, but he lived in Batman's territory. He would need to craft another, more suitable mask for his less subtle involvement in the future. One that wore something more resistant than leather, and used more refined weaponry than some stolen guns and his own claws, but he had all the time in the world for that. And life was good, or so he thought, before the bullshit started. The nightmare began when Bubbles entered with a stack of documents that needed signing, income sheets to be studied, propositions and deals to be validated, and some curated information about the territory, the city as a whole, and the world at large. He was dangerously clueless about the latter. Business as usual for the vampire and ghoul. Reginald would usually do at least half a dozen runs like this one on a regular night. Growing pains, his accountants told him. They just need to consolidate power, get some competent managers ready, and implement a system of checks and balances on his subordinates that doesn't involve directly utilizing his big vampiric stick. Then his more straightforward ventures will practically run themselves while he indulges in endless feeding, fighting, and other words that start with the letter F and make unlife worth it. But till then, he would face the paperwork with dignity. Dignity that was challenged by the world's unexpected attempts at doing him like Marcellus Wallace. The issue was a simple observation made by some taxi drivers who worked for him, something rather innocent at the moment. An increase in nondescript high-end cars and security details. Now, in a metropolis like Gotham, where wealth disparity was bigger than the Grand Canyon, it was nothing of note. But said cars were moving in a convoy toward the less privileged parts of town. Still, John had dismissed it as some foolish child of a crime family eager to flex his inherited muscle in front of the peasants. But the reports kept coming about increased police presence, high-end businesses either closing shop for the night or preparing to do so, and limousines and private jets taking off one after the other in a rush for no obvious reason. "Boss, I got another call." Now it's the construction crew by the arbor who saw something fishy. A bunch of glow-in-the-dark bastards hanging around. Reginald had said, making the vampire sigh for yet another time. It was annoying having enough influence to know that something was stinking, but not enough to locate the bag of odorous excrement. He would have sent Copperhead out to snoop around if she weren't useless at recon and intel gathering, usually being served most of it on a silver platter by the cartels or the client, or at least enough for her to start tracking her mark. Yet another weakness he ought to snuff out. "It's the fourth time tonight," John said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Call up our guys and tell them to go back home. Something ain't right. All of them. All of them," John nodded. "Tell them they'll be paid regardless. Better lose some money than solid workers." "Will do," Reginald said with a proud but amused smile, the one he gave each time John did something morally right. His feelings were appreciated, but it was far from enough to unwind the situation they were in. At least he wanted to know what on earth was happening so he could act accordingly. Being left in the dark was unbearable. He would soon come to regret that sentiment. Beep, beep. The ghoul's brick of a phone rang, and after bidding him answer, John felt 1,001 things going wrong with his servant. First was his blood flow almost stilling, then his heart rate going crazy, the sweat glands on his body activating at once, his eyes dilating as his body was given a fully natural shot of adrenaline. But none of that could compare to the sheer wrongness he felt when his superior hearing picked up exactly what was said. Not even the realization that it was Sweet Vicky's voice doing the reporting. The Joker broke out of Arkham and has already been cited committing multiple counts of grand theft auto, arson, mishandling of dairy products, and multiple counts of very enthusiastic murder. Harley Quinn was cited alongside the clown but was apparently violently thrown off their speeding car onto police vehicles during his escape. They still managed to lose her somehow. Citizens were urged to go home and lock themselves inside and call the authorities if they see, hear, or smell anything suspicious. Avoid drinking tap water, showering, or leaving their homes until the suspect is apprehended or the water supply is properly secured and tested. For a moment they both stood there, like any regular Gothamite would upon hearing the news, minds racing yet going nowhere, until Bubbles broke the silence. "Shite." John agreed with the sentiment. Shit indeed. So much shit it would soon be hitting the fan, along with everything else. The next 10 minutes were a frenzy of phone calls and orders. Information was shared and commands given, all in a desperate attempt to overcome the lack of sophistication of John's circle. East End had yet to recover from the changes within, and now on top of the inner struggles of addicts and criminals trying to turn their lives around. The danger of greedy men and organizations eager to reverse what they've accomplished just to make a few bucks. And the cops and politicians feeling restless when things got better without, if not because of their lack of involvement, the district might have to endure whatever madness the Joker had planned this time around. John couldn't let that happen. It would set him back entire months. His constantly changing 7-year plan to clean and healthy blood supply would be all but ruined. But he couldn't go out and break the clown's head like a grape, if not due to the physical risks of something like him touching the Joker's blood, then because the guy's boyfriend was just too damn good at finding and beating stuff he had no business beating. Sickening a copperhead on him was also a no-go, for obvious reasons. So he'll have to do it the good old-fashioned way by standing vigil and using that utterly abominable cocktail of dominate and presence and maybe a couple drops of blood on some lesser enemies before throwing them at the clown prince of crime if he ever shows his pale, grinning self this side of town. Part of him could sense a disturbance in the forces that shape his fate, like the sound of 1,000 zippers being opened and the rising spirit of broken men who fell prey to the temptations of the hose, crying out for him to somehow seduce Harley Quinn and drink the ecological hazard that is her blood. Make her addicted to the bite as a blood doll, eager to please, so long as she gets that ecstasy, even if it means bleeding her dry. Or ghoul her, making an already big problem worse for everyone else, boosting her crackhead levels of strength and durability even further beyond. But he was wise to the ways of the hoe and thus repeated the rules of his blood. Do not sink your fangs in crazy, lest you catch an STD. John nodded sagely, grabbing his coat as he left the room, but not before leaving Reginald with some very precise instructions. Don't mess up, he said, then ignored the long string of rather colorful curses that came out of the older man's mouth. Where are you going? Reginald asked, holding a cumbersome mobile phone heavy enough to knock out somebody. Please, tell me you're going to put down that son of a gun. Serving as a blood bag might just be the only decent thing he'll ever do. Crime Alley, I've got to pick myself up some new meat bags. Associates. He answered while opening the window, looking with more than eyes for any would-be observer. And no, there is no world where any fluid that came out of the Joker or his crazy girlfriend would ever enter my glorious person. Not a fan of Quinn? She's got some nice booty from what I've heard. The man smiled wistfully, the chaos forgotten for a precious few seconds. John looked at him blankly, electing not to mention the number of children she had murdered. The man earned his dirty thoughts. And truth be told, she did have a nice bum. I was talking about Batman, but Harley works too. Just like that, he was gone, falling off the 5th-floor window while his first retainer laughed his butt off. He had long shed the lingering human fears that told him it was a bad idea to act so recklessly, that he would collide with the ground in an explosion of meat and bones, becoming one with the pavement. Now there was only the thrill, the slowed perception that allowed him to enjoy every sensation, every microsecond of the scenery only the most foolhardy could experience. Without thinking, he knew what to do and when to do it. Knew to slow himself down ever so slightly by grazing the building's wall with his palm, and knew to contort his body in such a way that he could grab onto the emergency staircase and launch himself above and over a neighboring low rise. Then, it was only a matter of staying vigilant, keeping his sense extended and primed to pick up on any masked stalker while he ran faster than humanly possible, jumping from roof to roof, all under the cover of the night. In the distance, he could almost hear the sound of gunshots and police sirens, of a mad cackle that would haunt the dreams of many. A haunting laugh, one that promised great pain, endless tragedy, and a glimpse into the twisted psyche of a cruel genius. It took less than half an hour for John to bend the minds of 24 men of dubious virtue, half as much to send them armed and ready to brideshead, and twice as much to realize the Joker was not coming. The city got off relatively unscathed, with nothing but a high amount of business being wasted, money disappearing, and a couple dozen dead, injured, and otherwise disappeared men and women who had the worst day of their lives. The clown did break into a covert military research lab, presumably to gather components to spread his Joker toxin through the city, but the bat stopped him before the worst-case scenario could happen. 2 days later, the media was done reporting on it, instead favoring the next big investment gala, celebrity scandal, and political empty talk. 1 week later, he was taken to a court of law and judged insane, sent off to Arkham Island, and promptly forgotten about. Murders still happened, corruption kept going, smuggling never stopped, and the drugs flowed in and out of the harbor and into the needles of thousands of junkies who did their part in feeding the economy. Wine was drunk, hands shaken, and deals made for the betterment of the few and the misery of the many. Through it all, the vampire kept watch, steadily carving out his own little world amidst the madness. A sliver of control, which he jealously guarded, bettering the lives of dozens, hundreds, and thousands of citizens. Dollars were gathered and allowed to flow, never hoarded in inflated stocks and offshore coffers. Not a dime leaving his little world unless there was truly no other way. Everyday people made their cases in front of accountants, lawyers, and assistants who compiled all the complaints, wishes, and propositions for their machine to study and evaluate. Investments were granted to even the most unseemly of goat lovers, the most damaged of junkies, and the most unlikely of felons. Many failed, some did not, but a new game was being played where crime had once ruled. Steadily overtaking the old ones, cappers were traded for labor. Nights of smoking and drinking turned into meetings and community college courses. There was peace paid in blood. But as violence subsided and life became quieter, people were starting to take notice. They saw the possibilities, the interests being threatened, and the wealth that could be made in the now revitalized streets. They sought to bring back the old game or change the new one, unaware of the beast that lurked within, whose violence faded into obscurity as more corpses were made and blood spilled. But that was fine. Life was just one big joke after all. Following his escape from Arkham Asylum, the suspect known as the Joker committed numerous violent felonies across Gotham City over a 48-hour period. Confirmed charges include multiple counts of first-degree murder. Victims include GCPD officers, civilians, and a firefighter. Involuntary manslaughter, via reckless chemical exposure, voluntary manslaughter, per witness testimony, enthusiastic manslaughter, according to suspect. Armed hijacking of a city transit vehicle, resulting in a high-speed collision, arson, destruction of a residential care facility, biological tampering, release of venomous reptiles in a populated area, surgical mutilation of a civilian, later discovered at a mayoral function, evidence tampering, destruction of GCPD property, obstruction of justice, deliberate interference with emergency response units, mishandling of dairy products. According to local milkman. Indecent exposure, according to local milkman. The suspect was apprehended after breaking into a restricted military research facility, where authorities believe he intended to mass-produce his signature neurotoxin. The Batman, an unsanctioned vigilante, intervened before further casualties could occur. State Superintendent Harkness condemned the undemocratic interference of vigilantes in police matters and issued a formal reprimand to officers who allegedly cooperated with the masked individual. The Joker remains in custody at Arkham Asylum. The GCPD urges any witnesses with additional information to come forward. Vampire Rule Number 69. Be yourself, unless you can be Alucard. Outside a laundromat, a balding gentleman named Ray sat on an upturned milk crate, a cigarette burning low between two fingers. Raymond McBride, or just Old Man Ray to everyone in the neighborhood, was one of those people whose routine was so rock-solid they became a permanent fixture. For nearly 40 years he'd been sitting in front of the same building, saw it change owners dozens of times, burn down 2 times, and turn from barbershops to sports bars to grocery stores until it became the local laundromat it is today. Today people used Old Man Ray as a landmark. The Irish grandpa with his never-ending pack of smokes and daily issue of the Gotham Gazette and an assortment of utterly revolting jokes was there every day of the week, sitting vigil exactly 15 minutes before the shift of dock workers started going home. He even doubled as an economic indicator. If times were good, he and his union friends would turn that lone crate into a small friendly hangout, playing checkers and obscure card games for pennies, candies, and a whole lot of cancer sticks, laughing until the moon set high and entertaining the locals. If times were bad, he would be sitting alone, the only dockhand who could afford to do the same amount of hours every day due to some lucky investment his father made back during the Prohibition. If times were really bad, then his friend would come back, but the games and smokes would turn into bottles and curses. Today he was sitting alone. There was still some left for the dock workers to come back, and while it would have alarmed the old heads a couple months ago, Now the mere mention of trouble was enough to bring an immediate and reassuring response. "John will take care of it," followed by a pat on the back and a promise to call this or that friend who could make sure Harker would hear about their grievances. He was their very own Bruce Wayne, dark hair and blue eyes, a body that no paper-pushing businessperson should have, and that little voice in their head that made them do nice things for people who very much do not deserve it. Except that he was far younger, probably younger than most of the neighborhood women would like if some rumors were right, not that it could ever stop them from trying. Infinitely poorer and lacking in the whole rich industrialist parents department, Johnny Blue Eyes didn't go to any fancy private schools. Has a former crackhead for a personal assistant instead of some British butler, and he probably personally buried at least a couple hardcore drug peddlers who just couldn't tell their time in Brideshead was gone. As far as old Ray and every sensible person he knew were concerned, it was much better that way. Sitting in his spot, Ray watched the lad clean the district one block at a time, neighborhood by neighborhood, doing more to help folks that their own parents did, and making sure they didn't mess it up because their sickness was frying their nerves and turning them even dumber than usual. He watched people go from stealing pipes to installing them, from jacking cars to fixing them, and from living their lives chasing that $10 high to dedicating their time to helping others overcome it. Could make a grown man cry. Not him, though, he was no pansy. Today, he was still watching as the first of his mates swung by, having made too much money to quit his job but too little to actually like it. He watched as they traded jokes and barbs, pondering whether they should play something or just relax and wait for the rest of the boys to show up. Until he saw something that made him want to rip out his already thinning red hair, to stop watching and go introduce a few apparently brainless heads to the brick wall. He watched as a trio of young men in baggy clothes loitered near the curb, swaggering as if to convince themselves and others that they were actually somebody, whispering and touting to anyone who passed by. Of course, everyone could see what they really were. Fresh dealers barely out of school. Ray took a drag and exhaled. "That's the 5th time this week," he muttered. Behind him, a younger man leaned against the laundromat's brick wall, arms crossed and face hard. "Shit, I'll call Goaty." Goaty wasn't a real name. None of them used real names anymore, not for this sort of thing. Goaty ran with the neighborhood watch full-time. Harker's guy got him the job and a steady check as thanks for helping them out with a pickleback when things were much rougher and people a lot less trusting of them and their work. The watch was a collection of reformed ex-cons, ex-junkies, and men who didn't want their kids growing up in the war zone they once did. They weren't cops, they weren't vigilantes, and most of them didn't do it as a full-time job. Just a bunch of men with phones, nickels, legally owned guns, and a deep, burning hatred for what Brideshead used to be. And tonight, they were getting real tired of these kids showing up where they weren't wanted. No need. They are already here. Old Ray could almost smile if the whole thing weren't so darn depressing. Across the street, another small-time crew tried to push into a bodega. The owner, a wiry old man named Hector who had somehow been there even longer than Ray, watched them from behind the register. He knew their type, knew what they wanted. Once upon a time, he had no choice but to lower his head and let them use the prime real estate that was his shop, selling some dope where he sold groceries, bringing 304S where children would come buy cheap candies. It was humiliation, one he would never taste again if he could help it. "Don't bother," he said as one of them stepped inside. "Ain't no room for you here." The dealer, a skinny kid with too much confidence and too little experience, grinned. "Come on, old man. We just want to do business. Business. Buy for $1, sell for $2. As if they were selling umbrellas and not an elixir capable of ruining your life for a few bucks. Hector didn't move. "You want business? Buy something. Otherwise, get the hell out." The kid's grin faltered. Behind him, 2 men stepped out of the back room. Neighborhood watch, armed but quiet, lacking in anger but intimidating like only disappointed middle-aged men could be. Their eyes were dead serious, challenging them to try and reach out for the iron tucked in their pants, charged and just waiting to blast off their own arse if they fell down the wrong way. The kid hesitated. Then he left, his associates in tow. It was getting too common for Ray's liking. For a precious few months, they would hardly see one or two fools trying to set up shop, and they would be driven out with vengeance. But it seemed like people were getting greedy again. Ray was old enough to smell the shit before it truly fell on them, and right now it was stinking all over the place. Bloody bastards! He cursed, burning up his cigarette with one breath before exhaling a whole cloud at the sky. It was almost beautiful in a very carcinogenic way. It's just some kids. They'll get scared and stop this nonsense. Matt tried to reassure him like the kind, foolish child he was. Ray couldn't help but laugh. That's not how it works, kiddo. His mates, who were old enough to know better and somehow calm enough not to be wheezing, explained to the 20-year-old. Matty boy was too young to remember the last time it happened. The way the circle of life had manifested in Gotham's stinky, no-good parts, the fiasco the rest of the city had long since given up on. Do you think kids get dope on their own? Middle schoolers? You had that kind of money, boy? His old friend Polly, no relation to the dinner, asked. The kid couldn't get the opportunity to answer before another old sack of bones jumped on the opportunity to eat some fresh meat. A hobby the older members of the Gothamite working class have earned. No, they don't, but they don't have the balls to refuse easy money when they are offering. He shook his head, scoffing even while knowing that their own colleagues really are no better. There was no need to say who they were. Everyone with more than 2 functional brain cells could put 2 and 2 together. Matt, however, aimed to impress. Who? He asked, brown eyes open wide like someone who has yet to be spat on the face or shanked in an alley because somebody wanted his $10 really badly. The eyes of somebody who didn't belong here, and that's what made it all the more tragic. Everyone's son, Ray told him almost kindly. Everyone. Vampire rule number 30. If the author doesn't write the correct number, or any number at all, just ignore it. You're getting a double release. They were making a move. John knew it would happen. That was a rather common feat for a world-hopping vampire, but it was true nonetheless, and for once it had nothing to do with any sort of foreknowledge one could achieve through months spent without touching grass or showering. No, this required a bit more practical experience. From the very moment he sent Copperhead to cut off the heads of the local drug lords, emasculating the main economic engine that drove Brideshed's million-dollar criminal world and leaving the smaller group scrambling as their lives collapsed. It was a bold action, perhaps too hasty, but one he did not regret. The results it produced across every level were simply too great. The lack of organized channels of supply, paired with the loss of the respect and fear the criminal entrepreneurs of the land had carefully cultivated, had done so much to wean the citizens off their reliance on chemical relief, to convince them that change was not only an option, the objectively superior option at that, but also the only one they truly had. He gained over 2,000 employees, both direct and indirect, and the means to provide for and profit from them. Invested in many more so that they might have a chance at realizing their projects. Not to mention the massive step forward in making the local blood pool at least somewhat tolerable for his palate. The conquest of Brideshead was in this sense a total success. However, for every action, there had to be a reaction. In the last 2 weeks, he had received an alarming amount of reports indicating increased criminal activity, operations and moves he had not approved, and cappers he had expressly forbidden in his domain. Kids giving out testers free vials of dope and coke to prove their product was the hottest poison out there, sometimes literally. A bit of rat poison in the dope will drop even the hardiest junkie, and the rest will buy the strong shit long before their friend's body cooled down. He wasn't hard like them after all. Small-time gangbangers trying to move into the territory, peddling their own shit products in streets that are trying to get clean, and intimidating shops to get pocket money when the business is lacking. Break-ins, carjackings, and excessive violence. Nothing that required either him or Larissa to step in. The newly expanded Independent Neighborhood Watch was strong and scary enough to intimidate most of the mischief out of the area and break the kneecaps of those who didn't get the memo. Nor was it big enough to alarm the population as a whole. A few dozen extra crews lost in nearly 120,000 more or less clean citizens wasn't exactly bad news, especially to Gothamites. Few truly understood what was happening, but those who did see it did not like it one bit. It was partly for them that John doubled down on security initiatives, bleeding money to personally fund legal armed security for everything from mom-and-pop shops to housing blocks and parking lots, doing the same for the neighborhood watch. Reginald had nearly lost his mind getting approval to install CCTV cameras in every possible corner they owned, and the lawyers they hired weren't doing much better. It took John's personal intervention to convince the local councilman that he should approve of his plans without making a fuss. It involved a generous use of dominate and presence, some aphrodisiacs, and a video of the gentleman and a pig having a nice time. Needless to say, the good Mr. Jenkins was more than happy to sign anything and everything they put in front of him, from construction approvals to special grants for the rehab center and much-needed city funding for rec centers that were until now financing a lakeside property in Maine. In any case, the cameras were installed, and John's men were now safe from the angry arms of Uncle Sam and his boys in blue. He had the best lawyers he could find ready to ensure that. The expansion in his severely lacking intelligence collection capabilities was just the cherry on top of a morally dubious cake. It did wonders for people's morale and sense of security and was very efficient at keeping the scums out or at identifying the more discreet bad actors and sending a very clear message. Reginald sure appreciated the easier workload, but John wasn't nearly as happy. It was obviously just the start. Someone was sending these low-budget crooks his way, and he did not know who was doing very nasty things to his not at all paranoid mind. It's not paranoia if the world's really out to get you, after all. Just good sense. Many possibilities were on his mind, from remnants of Hungary's organization and allies looking for a comeback in this prime bit of real estate. Rogue actors who did have their own developed organization like Sionis or the Penguin, both of whom had suffered some major setbacks lately, either went to the bat or fellowed outlaws. Or perhaps he had a Lancer's luck, and the worst-case scenario was happening. The Cosa Nostra, or Carmine Falcone, the Roman, and his criminal empire are the real big players in Gotham's underworld. Giant Byzantine organizations that are hopefully much too big and sophisticated to act so soon on a relatively minor theater, for groups like them that deal with billions of dollars in hard drugs, weapons, and other services. A single neighborhood that was worth at most a couple $100 million if cultivated correctly should be a non-factor. They had dozens of strong metahumans, many more skilled enforcers and hundreds if not thousands more or less disciplined troops, with subordinate gangs being able to field their own numbers and their finances allowing them to hire the best of the best if push comes to shove. Not to mention their powerful suction on politics, police, and foreign organizations. Devouring their best attack dogs was an appetizing prospect, one that made the beast within growl and approval, but he didn't even need to look at the system information to know he would be beaten. If not in direct battle against stronger superhumans, weaker foes with better equipment, training, and numbers, then a simple war of attrition would do it. It was hard to sustain an intense conflict when you could only move at night. Even if his foes played by the same rules and didn't try to smoke him out during the day, a simple bad matchup, one enemy who manipulated sunlight or fire, and John would be roasted into final death. It hurt his pride to admit it, but you had to be realistic with these things. This was, however, all conjecture for the time being. John needed to know who was trying to ruin his work, and regardless of the answer, he needed to get stronger to take them down. And that meant blood. Lots and lots of blood. Vampire rule number 31. Don't let people know that ending your cockroach-like existence is as easy as opening the curtains. The night was young at Mariposa Plaza, a former open-air drug market the likes of which only Brideshead could produce. One of those plots of utter hopelessness where a mother would once ignore the cries of a hungry babe to earn her $10 any way she could. Where grown men would buy vials from their own seed, which they abandoned for the same chemical happiness. But that was the past, and there was no sense in dwelling on it, not when the future had just started showing promise. The drugs had been chased off, and those who peddled them had to either follow the needle out or clean their whole act up. Jobs were being opened every day, people going from clinics to rehabs to formations to gainful employment. So when people saw a rather familiar five-man crew setting up shop right there next to the low-rise buildings, the stash barely concealed by the bushes, it didn't take long for people to realize what was happening and pick up their phones. Not to call the police. This was still Gotham. But they had their own barely educated boys with guns, sticks, and anger management issues, though they were actually held accountable for their actions, so the comparison didn't work all that well. As luck would have it, though, they didn't come before an unpaid concerned citizen showed up on the scene, saw the ugly mugs of people he knew since kindergarten, and got understandably emotional. The main emotion involved being rage. The rage of someone who lost a child to a stray bullet. The rage of someone who had to live knowing the police barely tried to look for the culprit. The flashing cars and boys in blue leaving as soon as the cameras did, never to be seen again. The rage of someone who finally found some solace in knowing that things were being done to prevent such tragedy in his home. A man who was dead set on doing his part, be it by working in the soup kitchen or scaring some kids straight. The rage of someone who was very likely to crash and try to fight five men alone. The key word being try. Rage did not make the common man all that strong. Not nearly enough to subdue five thugs or to keep them from beating him to an inch of his life when he inevitably failed. Broken bones, torn ligaments, internal bleeding, and a concussion. His wrist had been shattered and needed urgent surgery. His liver had been terribly abused even for the 30-year-old Irishman that he was, and the odds of him recovering fully were very slim. Add in the fractured skull, and you got a recipe to make an American cry. That was the state of James Wood when John visited him on his hospital bed. He was but the first of many victims who experienced the second wave of crime that hit Brideshead. When the runts of the litter had been sent packing by nothing more than a few locals with boomsticks, it didn't take long for a higher class of criminals to show up. Gangbangers that were kicked out when Brideshead was cleansed are back with vengeance. Soon after came the outsiders. Armenian mob splinters with slick suits and Eastern European accents, watching from cars with tinted windows, running around trying to collect protection money as if it were still the 80s. Small sects of the 88s, fresh from Chinatown, are moving quietly in the corners. A crew of Dominican hitters from Washington Heights got caught on security footage moving into a long-abandoned barbershop. Some were just stupid kids, eager to carve out a name, but others had real backing. Because someone wasn't just poking around anymore. They were coming back for the whole thing. Corners that had been cleaned up and free for nearly a year lit back up like old wounds. Surveillance footage showed known pushers with fresh gear. Street deals. Quiet turf fights that didn't make the news. More fires, more stabbings. Not chaos yet, but the kind of disorder that grows. People started to slip. Some of the addicts who'd been clean relapsed. One of the watch guys took a shotgun blast to the arm in a shootout near Maple and 6th after trying to grab a stash. Kids stopped showing up to the evening tutoring program. Someone firebombed a food bank. It made no sense. It was just bad business.
Arkeres von Ronostop.
He was calm in public, always, but in private he was pacing, reading dossiers, watching footage over and over. Copperhead was deployed twice in 2 nights, and her new assignment in Europe meant the workload would go from bad to worse. At least Reginald kept close, always listening, taking notes, and filtering the hundreds of voices calling for help, guidance, and vengeance. John already knew. He knew this wasn't some random fluctuation of the streets. Someone was sending these people. Someone was investing in the destruction of Brideshead. It all fit. Someone was ready to light a fire if it meant smoking him out. The possibilities churned in his mind. Black Mask had the money. Penguin had the distribution lines. The remnants of Hungary's cartel had motive. Falcone's old guard could be reaching in. Even the Cosa Nostra might be making a play. Could be anyone. Or worse, everyone. So John made the call. He visited the hospitals. Looked each wounded watchman in the eye. Promised them everything he could. Slipped a few drops of blood where it was needed. He spread the word any way he could that the fight wasn't over. That what they built still mattered. which was technically true. Comfort was needed to control the chaos, and so he stood in front of James Wood, unconscious on a hospital bed, battered and bruised, the perfect representation of Brideshead as his new foe would see it. And he offered him a vampire's right to patronage, a few drops of blood slipping into his lips, manipulated to enter his system and rouse strength that he had not, numbing the pain and stopping the bleeding and slowly mending the bones in the way only a ghoul could. It was a small mercy on his part, hardly more consequent than paying his hospital bills and making sure his rent and bills were taken care of while he recovered. But to the man, to the community, such gestures meant everything. It was worth a few minutes of his life. He left the clinic as a man, flirted with nurses, and joked with the janitors. He waved them goodbye before the pretense was done and the disguise abandoned to show the monster within. A monster that moved at impossible speeds, scaled walls with remarkable ease, and abused this formidable prowess because he did not have a driver's license and Reginald was too busy doing both of their jobs to play cab. Their thing wasn't as much of a well-oiled machine as the people on the ground thought. It was only the superior capabilities of vampires and ghouls that made it manageable, the use and abuse of his powers to fix mistakes or sway people's opinions. That, and a whole lot of blackmail. At least he managed to keep the economy stable and growing, though. Maybe because he didn't impose tariffs on everyone. That night alone, John had to personally raid 5 crews whose activities ranged from heroin retail to trying to set up a prostitution ring. 5 completely unrelated crews whose members had nothing interesting to say about who sent them or why. Bottom feeders, the lot of them, though of a higher quality and greater diversity than usual. He disposed of the drugs, guns, and money in the nearest safe house and prepared for the impending sunrise, but not before making a final phone call to make Bubbles' life that much harder. "It's time," he said to Reginald, his voice low and final. "Enact Project Hermes." "FUU," was the ghoul's answer before John hung up on him, the very creative stream of expletives he let out lost on him. John chuckled as he slipped into a pitch-black sleeping bag that covered his entire body within the reinforced panic room, just in case someone leveled the whole building during the day, which was an actual worry in Gotham. He could almost imagine the ghoul waving 2 middle fingers at the phone, saying very correct things about John's mother and the way she raised him, as well as many incorrect things about the nature of his existence, like whether bloodsucking was gay, in addition to some things that would just get him canceled by everything from radical feminists to the Chinese Communist Party and Diddy himself. But eventually he would settle down and do the job. In the coming hours, lines that shouldn't have existed were crossed. Bribes moved through back channels. False documents crafted by experts who didn't know they were being watched. Photos edited, lives fabricated, Copperhead's tasks in the old continent would be used to the fullest. Some people would be selected to receive the unpleasant experience of being dominated with various commands and flooded with so much presence their minds would become most malleable, vulnerable enough for him to implement a few minor suggestions about the distant past. It was a thorough act of mostly unnecessary deceit, a money sink worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, involving multiple levels of blackmail and contingencies the human mind could not conjure in this relatively simple era, before the capes and cowls truly changed the world. Some would say it's too much, but John knew it was the bare minimum, because it was the only way one could fool the world's greatest detective. Crime Alley didn't change. Not really. The buildings got older and more cracked. The light posts flickered less now, the city finally giving up on them. But the darkness, the rot, that stayed. From the days long before Martha Wayne's pearls were scattered around by one of the world's most influential muggers, to grand eras of criminal prosperity and opulence, to those angry nights from the Batman's early years when he was eager to break the bones and shatter the ligaments of any crook, thug, or wise guy foolish enough to leave their homes. No, the filth only grew more and more depraved every single year, and now at the end of the millennium, it was more shameless than ever. Some bemoan and complain over that fact. Others learned to make it their fortune. A group of them had gathered there that night, more than usual, but a dozen wasn't nearly enough to make waves. They were scattered around a half-collapsed warehouse foundation with bricks still bearing the black scars of old fires started by industrialists during the Great Depression. They figured out that insurance payments would bring more than their activities would in decades, and they were right, though their workers weren't feeling all that happy about it. And just like the tycoons of old, these men weren't just junkies or corner thugs. They were here for business, the likes of which only Gotham could provide so readily to upstanding gentlemen like them. A weapons shipment, cheap Eastern European surplus, mostly Serbian, mostly garbage, but garbage that still fired bullets. Most of the time, AK pattern rifles with duct tape stocks, black market handguns, and even a few light anti-armor devices nobody in their right mind would try using in Michigan, let alone Gotham. The rumor was the crates came straight from some warlord's bunker via a shipping crate that never got checked. The man who arranged it, Tony Ribs Manera, leaned against a stack of rusted barrels, laughing as one of his guys playfully waved around an old M72 rocket launcher like it was a prop in a music video. "Hey, Zeke," Tony called out, voice rough like sandpaper soaked in cheap whiskey. "You think this bitch still works?" Zeke, a lanky man with rotted teeth and eyes too wide for his skull, grinned and pulled the trigger, eager to bring about freedom. Alas, nothing happened. The group roared with laughter. "Nah, man, don't point that shit at me," someone shouted, ducking and nearly spilling a bottle of bottom-shelf rum.
Pisicile dansează pe acoperișuri când plouă cu stele.
A tall man with a buzz cut and an Adidas-branded tracksuit added, nodding sagely. "Preach, Andre, preach," Tony said to the man who facilitated the deal. Talking to war criminals wasn't that easy for someone who only left Gotham to be jailed in New Jersey when Blackgate burned up. "What did he say?" one of them asked. "No idea," Tony shrugged. They passed guns back and forth, checked clips, and bragged about the price they paid for it all, almost nothing. The Serbs needed cash fast. These Gotham bottom feeders were more than happy to take the firepower off their hands. "Sell half to the kids out east. Flip the rest by Thursday," Tony said, holding up a semi-auto pistol and squinting down the sights. "We'll have enough to buy into that thing Penguin's throwing next month." It might sound presumptuous to assume it would go that fast, but this was Gotham. There was always a buyer for guns. The group wasn't just focused on deals. They were high, not on drugs, for the most part, but on the high of the moment. The idea that they were playing in a space that used to be forbidden to criminals of their class was too reasonable to be one of those nutcases in Arkham and too dumb to be a real crime syndicate. They were like modern-day conquistadors rediscovering the rich lands on the east side, spreading syphilis and smallpox to the natives, and screwing over everything from Park Row to Brideshead by the might of their not-so-fancy boomsticks. Until one of them disappeared. It was Frankie. Mid-laugh, mid-pull on a cigarette, mid-sentence. He just vanished. One blink he was leaning against the wall, trying to touch a suspicious stain on the wall, and the next, a blur of movement knocked him into the side of a rusted-out shipping container with a loud, metallic clang. His body hit and slumped, groaning, maybe unconscious, maybe not. Gotham thugs were made of tough stuff. The group froze, all 12 of them, now 11, eyes scanning the shadows. Zeke was the first to speak. "What the hell? Did you see that?" Stating the obvious was an art form. Someone else was already backing up, his hand on the grip of his pistol. Another one pulled an Uzi from under his coat and scanned the alleyway. "Shit, is that the Bat?" One whispered, saying the one thing no criminally inclined street guy wanted to hear, except the Joker, but he didn't count. "It's the goddamn Bat. Nobody else moves like that." Suddenly everyone was shouting, proper grammar be damned. Weapons came up. Fingers hovered over triggers, some shaking. A couple of guys started backing toward the warehouse loading ramp, electing to get the hell out without suffering severe brain trauma. A voice from the dark, cold and steady, broke the tension in half. "You're not supposed to be here," sounded more like a growl than anything human. The good news was that it wasn't the Bat. He only talked after breaking their bones. The bad news was that it wasn't the Bat, He might not stop after breaking said bones. They turned, but they couldn't see anything. Not really, just the dark. Then the red eyes came. Slitted, glowing, not bright like headlights but burning, watching, and moving way too fast for their taste. They fired. The alley lit up like it was 4th of July. Muzzle flashes cracked against brick and echoed off concrete. Bullets sparked against metal. Shell casings danced on the ground. But they weren't hitting anything. Zeke screamed as he saw something flicker between the shadows, impossibly fast. It was like fighting smoke. Every time he thought he had it in his sights, it was gone. Another man's gun jammed. Someone panicked and opened fire straight up, the shots punching holes in the warehouse roof. And then the screams started. Not from their mouths, but down the alley. One of the runners, he'd made it halfway before vanishing behind a dumpster, yelling the whole time. Then silence. Another tried to climb a rusted-up fire escape. A blur caught his ankle mid-lift and yanked him down. His body hit the pavement with a bone-splitting thud. The rest froze. The urge to run was there, screaming in their spines. But their legs, locked, hands shook. Sweat poured, and though none would care to mention, some urine too. Then he stepped out. Figure. Human-shaped, but only in the most vague sense. A man, tall and lean, with skin pale like sculpted marble. His face looked almost too perfect, too smooth, except for the long, angry red scar cutting from neck to chest, crossing his collarbones like a signature. His hair was long and black, pulled into a low ponytail with a single streak of gray that almost glowed under the alley lights. His coat flared slightly at the edges, long, old-fashioned, torn at the base. Beneath it, some might recognize the fine Victorian-inspired three-piece suit, but the subtlety was lost on this crowd. To them, he just looked like a corpse, and those eyes, red, slitted, hunting. 3 of the men dropped their guns. I can't," one stammered, hands trembling like leaves. "Strigoi," Andre whispered, voice cracking. But his wisdom was once more lost on them. The figure moved, slowly, like it was taking a stroll, as if giving them time to run, daring them to do so, to prolong the inevitable. No one did. He reached the first one, disarmed him with a flick of his hand, and drove an elbow into his stomach. The man folded like paper. Another braver soul tried to stab him, blade flashing in panic. He caught the wrist, twisted it with ease, and the knife clattered to the ground. Bones snapped. Screams echoed. He didn't kill them, but he didn't leave them whole. The thing moved through them like a storm, inflicting violence without so much a flinch, efficient to the extreme and utterly terrifying. He broke legs, crushed hands, and disarmed weapons. Then he tied them all together with restraints from his coat, dragging the unconscious ones to a neat pile under the fire escape. Tony, the last conscious man, looked up through bloody eyes. Who the hell are you?" The figure crouched, his red eyes meeting the man's as he spoke. "Alucard," and then he was gone. For the first time in his life, Tony Manera felt relief when he heard the sound of police sirens approaching. Mom was right. I should get a 9 to 5, he thought before blacking out. The laughter came first, soft, cascading like champagne over crystal flutes. It spilled from the ballroom, a low tide of indulgence, muffled only slightly by the soundproofed walls and the faint, deliberate string quartet in the corner. Silk gowns and Italian suits, heirloom jewelry and expensive watches, clothing tailored to perfection to mask the years of decadence and excess, show the status of tonight's patrons. The social engine of Gotham's elite kept roaring, oblivious to the chaos unfolding several districts away in Crime Alley. Then a bathroom door opened in the eastern wing of Palmer Mansion. John Harker stepped out with the calm grace of someone returning from a garden stroll instead of wiping blood from under his nails just 10 minutes earlier. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt with an idle, practiced motion. A second later, a server passed by, and John offered a smile that wasn't just polite. It was warm, curious, as if the man's entire existence had just become the most interesting thing in the room. The server smiled back genuinely, a little caught off guard, and moved on a little lighter on his feet. No words were exchanged, but someone's night was made a bit more tolerable. John walked in slow, casual strides, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't rush. He didn't slouch. He didn't strut. He simply moved, from corridors to stairways till he was back to the heart of the party. A kind of liquid confidence in motion, like his body obeyed rules the rest of them hadn't quite figured out yet. Not the kind of swagger that came from generational money or inherited status, or the try-hard, practice gait of new money entrepreneurs eager to prove that they were here to stay. It was older than that, more instinctive. A predator in a room of peacocks. A few heads turned. The older ones glanced, half curious, half confused, already trying to remember who invited him. The younger ones stared longer. One woman paused mid-sentence. Another dropped her eyes quickly, but not before he caught the flash of interest. He was good-looking, yes, his features too symmetrical to be average. That sharp jawline, the short dark hair neatly brushed back, the kind of blue eyes that seemed too pale to be real, too intense not to notice. But it wasn't just the face. It was the feeling. The young simply had too much presence. The heiresses, the ones too used to being tolerated instead of understood, who cared for nothing but their father's impending doom and the 10,000 ways they could splurge their money, leaned in and found themselves seeking validation. The wives of crumbling titans, draped in silk and sadness, lifted their eyes from their wine glasses. Even the caterers, those who'd worked enough rich galas to see every kind of fake smile, looked twice. He returned to the room like nothing at all had happened. Like he hadn't just spent the last 30 minutes showing Gotham that a new beast was on the prowl. A few of the wealthier guests nodded at him, unsure of whether to pretend to know him or just accept that someone like him probably belonged, even if they couldn't remember how. "Darling," cooed the hostess, a lean, predatory woman with a neck like a swan and a glass of Pinot like a sixth finger. "Where did you go?" Elizabeth Palmer, John's mind supplied after a microsecond, would-be novelist and chronic socialite, daughter of Helmut Palmer. Their family made a fortune in steel extraction and processing. She also happened to be his benefactor for the day, his alibi and ticket to the world of true parasites. Though he still couldn't bring himself to bite her, way too much perfume. "Got lost?" John replied smoothly, his voice soft and textured like aged wood. "In your mirror collection. I could have sworn one of them winked at me." It was a strange thing to say, but the Palmers had an entire room filled with ornate mirrors, old and new, each one worth a brand new car at the least. This kind of obsession demanded attention, and from the way her eyes shone with something that was almost alive, he was right. In an instant, it was gone, and the fake airs were back in force. She laughed, too loud, a little breathy, touched his arm without thinking, all the while thinking very hard about it. "I must say, I'm glad I insisted you come tonight. We don't get nearly enough exciting men anymore," she said, keeping her hand there a second more than necessary. "Oh, I think you have plenty," John said, gaze drifting just over her shoulder, looking at an 80-year-old shipping magnate trying to woo a woman 60 years younger. She laughed again, touched him yet again, and the nearby cluster of socialites, all teeth and champagne and golf course anecdotes, eyed him with a blend of interest and territorial tension. John felt better breaking the legs of some arms dealers, but this had to be done. A few feet away, standing half in shadow near the bar, two older men watched the interaction unfold. They were old money types, the kind that wore their suits a little too tight and their smiles a little too tired. Friends, in the way men like them could be. Same club, same tax brackets, same mistresses more often than not. "Is that him?" One of them muttered into his drink, a glass of neat scotch, half emptied already. "Hum," the other grunted, lighting a cigar with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring old rituals. Or at least trying to look like it. Harker. Something in construction, I think. Or real estate. Low end. East End stuff. Brideshead. You know. Heavens, that place? The first man laughed and took a sip. What's he doing here then? The hostess, the second replied, shrugging. She likes him. Young. Pretty. Not broke, technically. He's barely worth what I pay my lawyers annually, the first said. But look at him. They both did. And despite themselves, they frowned. The bastard looked comfortable. Walks like he owns the place. Talks like he's doing everyone a favor just by listening. You think he rehearses that? Not a chance. Bastard's too good. The first one glanced at his watch, then toward the far end of the room, where a woman in a shimmering black gown was sipping white wine and absolutely not looking at John Harker, which meant she was very much looking at John Harker. That your wife? He asked casually. The other man paused, turned, narrowed his eyes. No. Sure. She wouldn't. She knows better. Beat. Maybe I should go check on her. Yeah, probably for the best. They both laughed, but only one of them meant it. Back in the center of the room, the vampire sipped a glass of bourbon, which was really cherry juice, courtesy of his new friend among the waiting staff who was happy to accommodate his non-flammable beverage lifestyle and let the conversation swirl around him. He didn't need to chase them. They came to him. He said little, just enough. A few compliments. A story about a school he'd helped rebuild. Something funny about zoning permits and lobbyists. Funny for those in the know. Nothing too heavy. Nothing too polished. He wasn't from this world. Not really. Everyone here knew it. He was more of an attraction, like the musicians. But he wore it like a borrowed suit that fit better than the original owners. And while the others traded family names and hedge fund gossip, Harker listened. He took in names, faces, slips in language, desperation hiding behind rhinestones. He didn't need their money, at least not for the moment. He needed their secrets, their leverage, their belief that he might be one of them, that John Harker, while exceptional, was still ordinary. He raised his glass in a half-toast, smiling to no one in particular. Across town, red eyes faded from the rooftops, vanishing into the night. And inside the chandeliered warmth of the elite, John Harker laughed like a man who had never set foot in Crime Alley. Vampire rule number 29. Good enemies are hard to come by, but that's no reason to spare your son's murderer. Rupert Thorne liked to think of himself as a realist. Romantic notions were for politicians, artists, and idealists too naive to know the difference between poetry and pressure points. You didn't get to be one of the wealthiest, most feared men in Gotham by hoping for the best. You got there by bleeding the weak and paying the strong to bleed others for you. Which is why, when Brideshead went quiet last year, he didn't act immediately. He watched. He let the neighborhood do what it wanted, thrive under that clean-shaven charity boy John Harker and his naive little dream of rebirth. Let them plant flowers over bloodstains. Let them clap for their watch groups and their clean streets and their bright-eyed kids with scholarship dreams. He watched, and when the smiles stuck a little too long, he made his move. Now, Thorne sat back in a thick leather chair in the penthouse suite of the Van Walen Tower, 2 fingers of something Scottish and way too expensive burning in his glass. Smoke from his cigar curled around the high ceiling like a slow-moving specter. Outside, Gotham shimmered in its usual filth. Rain danced on glass. Headlights crawled like ants along arteries of rot and concrete. The city never slept because sleep meant silence, and silence meant time to think. He never liked silence. Status on North Palisade? He asked. A man in a tailored vest across the room cleared his throat. His name was Dreyfus. Smart. Ex-military. Cost a fortune to pull from Blackgate's contractor list. But he was worth every penny. Gone, Dreyfus replied, pager in hand. We lost the stash house, the cars, the runners, and at least 14 men. 3 more haven't checked in since last night. Thorne sipped his scotch. And the Payne Street Pharmacy front? Burned.
No survivors.
Redmond crew? Flattened. 3 in ICU. 1 paralyzed. Thorne nodded slowly. The numbers weren't good. They were expected, but they weren't good. Millions in assets lost. Hundreds of thousands in product gone. Years of cultivated contacts wiped in nights. It wasn't just the money. It was the message. Whoever this new freak show was, he wasn't out for intimidation. He was out for annihilation. Gotham's usual freaks left a body or two as a statement. This one left ruins. Piles of broken bones and promises. The most annoying part? He hadn't even seen the bastard's face. Do we know who it is yet? Thorne asked. Still no face, no name. Just rumors. Red eyes. Victorian coats. A monster out of folklore. They're calling him Alucard. Dreyfus smirked faintly. Someone so ugly should never do that.
Ew.
All vigilantes start cute, Thorne grunted. The bat started cute. Now look at him. He stubbed the cigar into a crystal ashtray, stood, and crossed to the floor-to-ceiling window. His reflection stared back at him. Bloated by wealth, aged by power. Slick gray hair, expensive tie. A face that had once known how to smile before it forgot why. He tapped the glass lightly. Bride's Head, he muttered. A district he longed to own, and he once nearly did. Not just in the backroom deal sense, but truly own. The bricks had paid him. The cops had owed him. He'd bled it dry until there was nothing left but hollow-eyed addicts and kids with 9-year life expectancies. That's how Gotham worked. That's how you carve territory. He was bleeding then too, losing money and men to upstarts and established powers alike. Some of them wanted a piece of the pie, others just wanted to deny him his due. Damn Falcone and his premium killers. Thorne scowled, the mere thought enough to make his wallet sting. But he persisted and carved his niche in this unforgiving world. Then that Harker kid came in like some goddamn human rights advocate and started preaching about hope. Buying properties, hiring security, cleaning house, and worse, he made it work. For a moment, Rupert felt that heavy weight on his belly, the one he felt when he snatched too much money off his father's register, and then saw the man's tired eyes as he struggled to pay the bills. And this time, he couldn't rob a tire shop to make up the difference. It was all that darn silence, making him think about useless stuff. Think that he wasn't really just a businessman who did whatever it takes to get his, that he was more than just another wolf biting his way into power in a place that demanded nothing less. That he might be what's wrong with the world. So he made some noise, brought in the heavy equipment, and started digging, looking everywhere for an answer that didn't make his stomach churn. And boy, did he find it. The ravaged bodies of those who would have ended this bullshit faster than you could say opium. Then he realized it wasn't Harker changing things. He was just a little do-gooder who showed up at the right place at the right time when a real monster imposed his will on the world. The way he did, the way everyone in Gotham did, from Carmine Falcone to Batman. That he could live with, the monster of Bride's Head, Alucard, whatever name aroused the little upstart and made him feel big and scary. He could even beat up a few meth heads and make him lose a couple thousand if it pleased him. That was just the cost of doing business. So long as he doesn't overstep. That couldn't be allowed. Not just because it was bad for business, but because it meant others would try the same. He'd have neighborhood revolts from the Narrows to Fracture Bay if he didn't gut this thing quick and send a message. But he underestimated Alucard. "Give me the full breakdown," he said, turning back to Dreyfus. 21 confirmed crews destroyed. Another 16 scattered. At least 7 independent contractors terminated. 4 million in damages and growing. Weapons, narcotics, vehicles. All gone. He said in the uncaring drawl of a man who killed for peanuts and a pat on the back. And all within a week? Dreyfus nodded grimly, which was just a regular nod for the guy. Impressive, Thorne admitted, almost amused. So, this ghost wants a war. I think he thinks he's already won. Dreyfus mentioned casually. Thorne chuckled, slow and sour. That's the thing with these vigilantes. They get cocky real fast. The Bat does it. Black Spider did too, before snooping around the Roman Empire and finding himself on the receiving end of Lady Justice and her big police stick. Sooner or later, they all think they're invincible. That's when they get sloppy. Start pulling files, Thorne said. Use our off-books people. No digital trail. Watch the public spaces. Look for body doubles. Patterns. I want everything on Brideshead. Boots in their trash and men in their towers. There was a pause just long enough for the room to breathe. I want someone in Brideshead. After a few minutes, Dreyfus gave a small nod. There's one possibility. Start with that, Thorne said. Let's see if we can peel the mask off. He crushed the cigar out, a harsh grinding motion that left the ash flattened and dead. It was the best way to destroy a vigilante. Remove the mask and the fear and find the man behind it all. And once he found the man, the rest was easy. I don't believe in ghosts, Thorne muttered sagely, an elegant smile on his face. So whoever he is, he's a man, and men make mistakes. Unfortunately, Rupert Thorne often forgets that he too was but a man, a miserable pile of secrets. Vampire rule number 30. If you can't beat them, wait till they die of old age. It was raining again in Gotham, a heavy, dirty rain that seemed to wash nothing clean. John stood under the awning of a tenement rooftop, watching the street below. Another scuffle was breaking out on the sidewalk. Two men in cheap windbreakers, shining badges clipped to their belts, were trying to shake down an old corner store owner. The owner, a frail man in his late 70s who knew every child in Brideshead by name, had been beaten last week for refusing protection. Tonight, he just shook his head as one of the cops pushed him against his own window and started yelling, spit flying everywhere. John didn't blink. He didn't need to. He could see it all. These weren't just low-level crooks. They were wearing uniforms now, or pieces of them. Tinted windows and badge numbers turned backward. Off-duty cops, maybe, or on-duty ones paid to be off the books for a few hours. Either way, they walked with the arrogance of men who thought the badge made them untouchable. It wasn't the first crew like them. In the last 48 hours, nearly every block in Brideshead had seen activity. Not from the usual addicts or petty thieves, nor the gangsters he sent packing every other night. Those came and went, always had, but from something coordinated, planned, professional enough to scare the locals and rough up anyone who asked questions. And smarter than the street gangs, too. No pattern. No había signature. Every crew is different, every tactic tweaked. Someone was sending in feelers, seeing how deep they could dig before something bit back. John didn't know who, but he knew why. Someone wanted Brideshead back the way it was, all dope and bitches and good business. They wanted the corners, the clientele, the muscle memory of crime that had once lived in the bones of this neighborhood. Someone was investing heavily to test the strength of the strange piece he'd built, and they were counting on one simple truth. Heroes didn't touch cops, even crooked ones. They investigated and pushed and made the operation fall apart. They exposed the corruption as if anyone gave a damn, as if those lads getting paid off hadn't already built a nest egg, as if they would get anything worse than a suspension or forced retirement. Pension very much included, of course. John smiled without warmth. I'm not a hero, he thought, his mind already coming up with new ways to make the human experience as miserable as possible. He could go and take a walk, but he was feeling fancy. By the next night, the message had changed. The cops weren't just ignoring the situation anymore. They were part of it. Patrols were redirected. Checkpoints moved. Search warrants mysteriously arrived where they weren't needed, while real crimes in Brideshead were overlooked. It wasn't a takeover. It was a bureaucratic slow burn. Legalized sabotage. He didn't feel like bloodying up uniforms just yet. That would mean accelerating his plans a bit more than he'd like. It also looked like his opponent was trying to make him do it, with how brazen the corruption was getting, even by Gotham standards. So he started listening instead. Reginald tracked most of the activity through CCTV patches the city forgot it had. The Harker Fund's Community Security Initiative had layered the streets in quiet tech. Cameras in lampposts, microphones in public trash bins, backdoors in police radios if you knew the right frequency. But hardware didn't give motive. It didn't give fear. John needed that to work. So he started watching up close, slipping between shadows, walking beside officers who never knew he was there, whispering into minds stretched thin by paranoia, alcohol, and guilt. Dominate wasn't a simple sledgehammer. It was a scalpel, a whisper where shouting would fail. It worked best on those already half-controlled by something worse. He met one of them, a younger cop named Finnegan, behind a strip mall 2 blocks south of the children's clinic. Finnegan had blood on his shoes and a receipt in his pocket from a place John knew didn't exist. The man blinked twice too slowly when asked who his supervisor was. John didn't ask again. He didn't have to. Finnegan spoke for 15 minutes straight, pouring out schedules, rendezvous points, known drop locations, and, most useful, names. The ones giving orders. The ones who weren't cops but still acted like they owned them. Finnegan didn't even know he'd been talking. When John released him, the man vomited, collapsed, and cried. Nothing further mental manipulations couldn't fix. Making him forget the last couple minutes was child's play for a vampire who reveled in the use of his power and had a steady supply of high-quality blood. That was the 4th one that week. But it wasn't enough to gather intel. It was time to apply pressure. So the 5th cop was different. His name was Myers. Greasy, bloated, with breath like rotten onions. He smiled too often, always with his tongue pressed to his teeth. Reginald flagged him as a consistent presence around missing persons cases that never made it past a desk drawer. A legendary sleazebag, in the ghoul's own words, even for a copper. John followed him for 3 days, watched where he lingered, who he threatened, what he liked. He didn't need much more. That night, he found one of the men on Finnegan's list, a small-time collaborator named Lorenzo Carni, a slick bastard with a love for firearms and a temper like gasoline. John took Lorenzo's mind apart like peeling an onion. He didn't even need to try, just pressed a single gloved hand against his chest and leaned in, showering him in just the right amount of presence before going for the big prize. That cop you don't like. The one with the little girls. He's a loose end. He knows your face. Kill Myers. He said the power behind each word increased exponentially as Dominate impressed them upon an already unstable mind. Lieutenant Myers being despised by everyone and their moms, including his own, probably helped. A few seconds after, Lorenzo's eyes turned blank, and he found himself wondering why he spaced out in a dark alley. That was a sure way to end up mugged by a fool or become the fool strapped to some psycho's dining table. But he found himself having the urge to do some community service. The next morning, Myers was found in an alley 3 blocks outside Brideshead, stabbed 16 times with his own boot knife. There was no press release, no memorial, just quiet rage inside the department. Cops don't give a damn when a junkie dies. But a dead cop, even a bad one, that changed the weather. For a brief moment, Gotham law enforcement started doing its job. Crooked cops who didn't want to end up like Myers stopped moonlighting in Brideshead. Patrols went back to normal. Internal affairs suggested officers limit contact with certain underworld figures, some of whom were big earners. John watched the ripples spread, not fully aware of who he screwed over, but enjoying it like a true hater. He still didn't know who the man behind the curtain was. No name, no scent, just the pressure. Whoever it was, they knew the game well. They weren't new. They were methodical, embedded, and smart enough to use both systems, legal and criminal, as levers. But now they were bleeding money. Their street soldiers were vanishing. Their favors weren't being returned. And John Harker was still standing in the middle of it all, untouched. There would be retaliation. He was sure of it. But he'd made his point. He didn't need to know who yet. He only needed the bastard to start panicking. And soon enough, he would find them. Vampire rule number 31. How do you hide a secret from the world's greatest detective? Even the air tastes different, she thought, enjoying a bit of sunlight for the first time in months. She was finally back home, but the very second she crossed the aisle into the Narrows and found herself back in good old Brideshead, she realized that her home was no longer the same. Sure, the same faces walked the streets, but they were no longer as haggard and stressed. Sullivan Joe was still standing on Monroe Street, but the old man was no longer shouting about this or that package in exchange for a couple vials. Stacy was still smoking too many packs by her staircase, but she was no longer dressed to impress $15 out of some disease-ridden punk. Kids were out there laughing, and not the desperate "our life is shit, so we might as well laugh" kind of sound, but the real kind. Laughing like suburban kids who have bikes and vaccines and a school night tomorrow with people who actually give a damn whether they get there or not. The kind you just didn't hear in the East End unless it came from Batman's boyfriend, or the clown's victims, depending on whether or not he got his hands on some chemicals. Yet here I am, sitting in a cafe of all things, eating muffins made by someone I swore I saw eat a rat back in the day after smoking a bad batch. And the place is so clean it might just pass the hygiene inspection without paying too many bribes. She shook her head, sipping on a latte and once again being surprised by how good it tasted. It was almost like people gave a damn, but that was just not possible. Maybe Nigma finally made that virtual reality headset he talked about, and this was his way of thanking her for saving his arse from a mean shanking back in Blackgate. It was more reasonable than seeing a hardcore dope fiend running a respectable establishment, the streets not being covered in stepped-on vials and used needles, or the fact that some of her fences somehow grew a conscience and decided that they were out of the game. All this brought one obvious question. What the hell happened while I was gone? She smiled nonetheless, ignoring the pit in her stomach. It was better to drown it in muffins than entertain those useless ideas. She should be feeling happy. Messed up as it was, Brideshead was still her home. The one she grew up in, the one she knew best. She cared about it and, on some level, cared about the people who lived there. Not the bastards, but the orphans and junkies and homeless who just couldn't pick themselves up but are now doing so well. You should feel happy for them. They were getting better. Without her. And back came the ideas, the useless, stinging thoughts. Maybe I was part of the problem? Now that was something even she couldn't take in stride. So she did what she always did. Ignored those pesky feelings and emotions and focused on what really mattered. The power, the thrill, and the accomplishment of getting hers all on her own. Whether it was cash, expensive necklaces, fancy heirlooms, or just answers. That was what fueled Selena Kyle, not pointless brooding. So when two black cars with blacked-out windows stopped by, revealing men with expensive suits and cheap smiles, she was almost glad for the distraction, the opportunity. She was glad for the opportunity to do something useful. Her first instinct was to run, blend in somewhere, and disappear. She might be a work of art all on her own, but she knew she could lose them in minutes dressed in plain clothes as they were. Then she realized who they were, noticed they didn't pull out guns, and understood that they might not be here to get back at her for something she stole, which in any case would be their fault for not guarding it better. So she paid what she owed, straightened her jacket, cocked her hip just so, and walked out of the shop in a way that made thousands of men shout, "Darn!" across the dimensions. Why? Because she could. As she exited the store, which had nothing to do with her desire to keep the owner out of trouble, they slid out of their polished shells, revealing the big and expensive watches that compensated for their smaller tools, the rings on their fingers, wallets in their pockets, and stacks of bills clipped behind their ties. All things she could collect in 5 minutes tops. But more than that, it was the way they walked around that caught her eye, like they were important people doing important business. Predators who thought they owned the food chain. Ew. It also meant they never had to deal with the more troublesome side of Gotham's criminal world, the one that wasn't afraid of crossing the big guy. They didn't pull guns. They didn't need to. The thing they were holding out to her was 1,000 times deadlier. An offer. She could smell it from across the cracked sidewalk. An opportunity wrapped in poison, stitched together with the kind of promises that left blood stains you could never scrub out. She should flip them off and leave or stay out of the mountain of trouble that would surely befall her if she listened or, worse, agreed to whatever sugar-coated nonsense they would serve. Nonsense that involved a lot of money. Yeah, I'm not leaving. That was obvious to one of the friendly neighborhood crooks, the taller one with the broken nose and small beady eyes, who smirked so repulsively she was tempted to make him uglier still. "Miss Kyle," he drawled, like they were old friends sharing a drink instead of a trap. "Heard you were back on the streets. Thought you might be interested in a little freelance work. And there it is, the trouble that will lead me straight back to the asylum." Selena shifted her weight lazily, giving him the full, unimpressed sweep of her gaze. "Opportunity's just Gotham's way of setting the hook?" she said, voice dry as cracked ice, betraying nothing of the amusement she felt. The heavy behind him, the muscle, chuckled low, a sound that suggested he was already picturing her with a knife in her back, if he was even capable of something as mentally taxing as imagination. The talker just smiled wider. He should really stop. It was painful to look at. "Depends who's doing the fishing," he said. Then, after a calculated pause, "Boss is willing to be generous. Wants a name, a face. That's all. Nothing's ever all with your boss." Selena snorted softly. She didn't need to say Thorne's name. It clung to them like cigarette smoke. They were too blunt to be with Falcone and too stupid to be Cosa Nostra, and anyone else had the sense not to approach her in broad daylight. Thorne's men, however, would do it on live TV. Their upstanding industrialist patron and his virtually limitless political connections would surely save them from the consequences. "No tricks," the talker lied easily. "Just information. Quick payday for someone with your talents." She let the silence stretch, enjoying the way he twitched under the weight of it. Finally, with a mock yawn, she ended his torture. "Who's the mark?" she asked. The talker leaned in slightly, lowering his voice like he was about to sell her a relic pulled from the deep. "A brand new pest. This one is. His name's Alucard," he said, passing her an envelope. "Now that is new." She tilted her head and let a slow smile curve her mouth. A smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Tell Thorne I'll think about it," she purred, and enjoyed watching them leave, still not noticing their lost watches. Fair price for wasting her time. The smart decision was obviously ignoring the offer and laying low for a few months, then getting back in the game with a few easy jobs. But she already knew the truth. She wasn't walking away from this. After all, there was only one thing better than stealing from a sweet little vigilante. Getting paid to do it. Selena nearly melted when she read the offer Thorne's loverboys gave her. A job so attractive she was absolutely certain they would double-cross her as soon as she got the little hero's safe cracked open and told them about his dirty little secrets. She still accepted, of course. Wrangling brooding vigilantes was something of a specialty of hers. Doing so in her own neighborhood? Now that's just child's play. It might have changed a lot, Brideshead, that is, fewer fiends and more work, fewer chances of getting randomly mugged too. But the streets and alleys? The rooftops and hidden paths? Those didn't change, and for the sake of her craft, they hopefully never will. How else would she track that feisty little guy down? It took her the better part of a week to get a glimpse of him, a short blur of motion falling down the high-rise buildings in a suicidal dive, which he somehow managed to pull off. He grabbed a steel rail and used the momentum to cross 5 blocks in an instant, leaving behind bent metal and a very impressed cat burglar who almost dropped her binoculars. This Alucard was fast. She'd give him that. "But you're also predictable, sweetheart," she purred from her spot on somebody's windowsill, pocketing a silver necklace she just needed to have. It was also a great spot to watch her mark without being seen. He might have been a vigilante, but he didn't have many qualms about looting his targets, which she understood very well. She wouldn't give up the opportunity to tax her foes either, which is why she also understood that after a juicy run, you just had to go back home to stash your lovely spoils in a safe place. In a safe house. Alucard's safe house. It was just a matter of finding some big game, getting a perch somewhere high and discreet, and waiting for the big bad wolf to come and get his prize. A couple high-quality cameras to do what her eyes couldn't and follow his movement, if barely, and she could already feel his sizable cash reserves in her hands. It was perfect, except for those poor dealers who sacrificed themselves for her greater good. But she was sure they'd understand. His den didn't look like much from there, but she guessed it was the point. Selena always made sure to have a nice penthouse ready for her whenever she was comfortable enough to settle down for a while. She even kept a few dozen fake IDs for that purpose, but his kind were partial to more Spartan accommodations from her experience. Some kind of masochistic streak hidden behind a facade of seriousness and duty. That would explain living in a vacant apartment complex that was closed down due to a gas pipe exploding and revealing enough asbestos to cover an elephant twice over and still have some left. Really, safe house was a generous term. The exterior looked like a kicked-in anthill of broken bricks and sagging fire escapes. The front door was chained shut, and the windows were all either boarded or cracked open just enough to invite tetanus. No one in their right mind would live here. It can't be good for your health, she'd said, shaking her head at those vigilantes and their questionable life choices. So of course Selena was interested, so she kept watching, switching vantage points every so often, leaving no marks he could use to track her. She scoped it from a nearby rooftop, lying flat against a half-collapsed HVAC unit, watching through binoculars with infrared filters. No heat signatures on the upper floors. No lights either, but the place felt watched. Her instincts were screaming at her to be careful or, better yet, get out of there fast and forget all about Alucard. But then she wouldn't be Catwoman. She went down the side of the building like a whisper, a grappling hook hooked to the lip of a bent billboard, descending with practiced grace. It was almost a pity nobody could see her. This was art worthy of Gotham's finest galleries, which she will probably end up relieving of their burden very soon. Black boots kissed the crumbling fire escape with barely a creak. She tested a window. Locked, obviously. Not a real lock, though. This was military-grade magnetic seal tech disguised as rusted iron. She smiled. Clever. Most people wouldn't notice. She reached into her pouch, pulled out a coin-sized pulse scrambler designed by Nigma in exchange for some hard drive he needed, and pressed it against the window frame. The seal gave with a soft hiss. She was in. Inside was worse than expected. Not visually. Visually it was perfect. Stained wallpaper, rotting carpet, the occasional dead rat. But she wouldn't have made it so far if she didn't know that some healthy paranoia could never hurt, especially when troublesome people were involved, and this Alucard was nothing if not troublesome. So she looked and kept looking, searching for any inconsistency before deciding that their absence was a red flag in and of itself. There was only one thing left to do. Trust her instincts and throw every trick at the wall and see what sticks. If nothing works, it might be better to collect what information she can, leave and plan a proper heist. Lucky for her, she had very good instincts. Selena pulled out a small mist sprayer, which could be used to spread anything from pepper spray to mild acids, but was currently only set up to project some harmless water. Nothing that could alarm whatever problem her mark had left here. With the press of a button, she could see it flow around the room to no effect, until the droplets clung to something that wasn't there. A closer look revealed rows upon rows of tripwire set up at every possible entrance, and then some, doubtlessly linked to an alarm system, death trap, or both. Probably both. Crafty bastard, she muttered, and used some more water just to be sure. But that much won't stop me. She moved slower, crouched low, activated the low-light filter on her goggles, made sure to avoid tripping the wires, smoked out some laser motion sensors that he really should try to hide better, and made sure not to step on the frankly amateurish pressure plates. You put these right alongside the lasers, in the exact places an intruder would have to step on to avoid the detectors, not after them. She shook her head. This will at least teach him a good lesson. If Thorne's men don't get him with a car bomb, that is. The troublesome part of her mind once more showed up to disapprove of her action, but she chased it off right away. This was neither the time nor the place for moral quandaries. She took this job, and so she'll do it properly. Right until they double-cross you, the same voice added, much to her dismay. Couldn't she engage in toxic, self-destructive behavior in peace? After what was essentially a walk in the park, where the only difficulty was her own misgivings with sabotaging the recovery and peace of her home because this violent deviant somehow managed to make vigilantism work, the traps were getting rarer, and she started seeing some genuine signs of life. Catwoman allowed herself a smile as she stepped into what looked like a normal home in the middle of a dump, somehow kept clean and livable, if a bit on the messy side of things. But who was she to judge? Half her wardrobe was scattered around her floor, concealing everything from jewelry to knives and fake IDs, and that was the case with nearly every house she kept. Alucard, though, lived in a simple 2-room apartment with nice wallpaper, cozy furniture, and just the right amount of chaos to know someone lived there. She could see paintings on the walls, photos of a cute little boy with his dog, and a faded family photo placed between 2 sets of ornamental swords and flintlock pistols carved out of ivory. She might steal those later, if his coffers are lacking, but she didn't care too much about that for the moment. Nor did she mind the modern kitchen or the old brown leather sofa with the soft, fluffy covers that would be comfortable as all hell and placed right in front of the TV. No, her eyes zeroed in on a specific painting of some old European castle, a large painting. "Oh, baby," she cooed, stretching her arms. "You really are too sweet for this game." Before she even realized, she moved it out of the way, revealing the delicious, amazing sight of a huge safe that she just knew she could crack open in less than 10 minutes. Then everything inside would be hers for the taking. This cute little monster had been terrorizing everyone and taking their money for himself, hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps even $1 million in bounty, not to mention whatever his obviously old and possibly loaded family left him. It was all there, ripe for the picking. "But first I need to know who you are, sweetie," she sighed, her hand hovering over the safe and its wonderful content. It took all the willpower she had and then some to let it out of her sight and start scouring the house for more information about him, which ended up taking less than 5 minutes. It was sitting on a shelf next to some old dusty books and a box containing what appeared to be his mother's silverware and a trophy for some junior fencing tournament, if the inscription was correct. Further down, a single name was etched on it. "Adrian Helsing," she read gleefully. "Now I know who you are." So she could get started on robbing him blind, telling Thorne's boy toys about it and getting her money before being double-crossed. But that just made things more fun. She might even tip him off about Thorne. That should make the annoying feeling go away and keep any voice of reason and compassion she had left nice and quiet, as it should always be. Not to mention that it would be a nice payback for when things go south with her current employer. "It's nice to meet you, sweetheart," she said, patting the trophy and putting it back in its place. "The pleasure is all mine, Catwoman." She heard a calm voice, almost amused, speaking out and felt her muscles freezing in place. Her thoughts stopped, and so did her breathing. Everything paused for a second while her brain tried to realize that he was standing there right next to her while she uncovered his identity. That she didn't notice him. That he let her search and find what she wanted. That she was probably not walking out of this one. Shit! She cursed, trying to come up with a scenario where she could defeat someone known to take bullets without flinching. Someone she saw moving at speeds that would make any ordinary human's neck break. Indeed. He nodded with a face that made it very clear that she was screwed beyond repair. At least she no longer felt guilty about screwing him over. So she did what she always did when put in a bad situation, burdened with expectations or threatened with commitment and meaningful connections. She ran away. Vampire rule number 32. The meat might be dead, but it shall rise again. Pain wasn't new to John Harker. He'd felt it in ways most men never could, or at least not without moving on to their next big adventure. Everything from torn ligaments that knit back together just slow enough for him to truly register every detail to a throat crushed under boot heel and healed before the next breath. A rib driven into a lung and pushed back out by sheer will and vampiric fiasco. He was a vampire. Some amount of torture was always part of the deal. But this? A sniper round through the chest? This was new. It would also be the second time he'd stand and allow himself to be shot at because a pesky little bird, or a nosy kitten, in this case, apparently lacked a sense of self-preservation. Perhaps she could consider stealing one? Now, John knew about Thorne's latest gambit. Not that his men hid it very well, doing their business in broad daylight right in Brideshead, in front of his people. It took less than a day for him to get a call about Catwoman being on the prowl, and hours later, Gotham's most sacred law of snitches get stitches was broken through a mix of goodwill, money, and common sense. He knew she was approached, knew the guys who did the approaching, knew how many years they spent in jail, what they did, and their favorite haunts. 5 minutes of Alucard's time were enough to track them down and use the Dumbledore style of investigative greater goodness to get his answers. After that, it was just a matter of watching her watching me watching over the East End and lure her into the fake safe house. He felt like gloating, but that was known to make things go horribly wrong. Like, getting his chest blasted by a sniper? Wrong. So John compromised and just teased her a bit while she was at his mercy instead of subduing her instantly and deciding whether he should turn her into an asset, a blood bank, or just let her go after some theatrics so she could ultimately leak his identity to Batman. He felt at ease when she literally leaped like a startled cat before somersaulting over him and promptly trying to get the hell out of there, which was honestly the right move. Bonus points for not trying to strike him on her way out. That would have gone poorly. What he didn't account for was the whip-like crack he heard nearly 3 kilometers east of the safe house, which he would have dismissed if not for the loud bang of a high-caliber rifle that came precisely 1.5 seconds after, which meant that the first sound was a sonic boom. It also happened to be coming right at him and would collide with the target in exactly 3.2 seconds. The walls were fragile enough to be broken by a good punch, so there would be little to no resistance on that front, unfortunately. He could, however, avoid it quite easily, if not for a tiny little detail. The impossible shot just happened to be passing right through the silly catgirl's abdomen as she was, once again, shocked into stopping by the gunshot, her heart skipping a beat and the hair on her neck rising as her whole body screamed that something was wrong. She won't duck in time, he thought, and he knew the shot would easily destroy her body. The scattered fleshy bits and blood would also ruin his drip, which was just criminal. So for the second time in months, he evaluated the situation and tried to decide whether or not it was worth the hassle. On the plus side, saving her life would go a long way to securing her as a somewhat useful asset, and his human resources department was in dire need of skilled workers who could operate in the Cape scene, even if limited to street-level threats and infiltration. It would also give him an in with the local villains, Batman, and a whole network of white-collar criminals to complement the rougher pieces he already scoped. On the minus side, unlike Copperhead, who actively wanted some structure and security and honestly couldn't make it without someone's support, or Bubbles, whose loyalty was enough to justify his ongoing war on drugs, Catwoman didn't play nice in groups. She was allergic to commitment, and John was all about long-term commitments. He wasn't exactly willing to keep her drunk on presence and use Dominate to reinforce it until she broke. Nor would he grant his blood to an unwilling, unreliable asset. Doing so was just asking to be kidnapped by greater forces and turned into a blood bank to grant them youth and vitality, empower their mooks, and be part of their grand plan for evil world domination. All in all, not a great idea. Sigh. I really should stop doing this, he thought, burning a bit of blood to force his body to move even faster than usual and then harnessing all possible resistance before the impact. It had the unintended effect of setting his already inhuman senses into a state of hyper-awareness, time seemingly slowing down just enough to truly feel the consequences of his action as a bullet larger than some people's handguns pierced through wood with ease before heading straight into his chest. It tore through reinforced flesh like a hot knife through butter, breaking bones and layers of solidified blood, scattering his body before losing momentum. Ouch! he said, only to regret it since it made him spit out some precious blood. Blood he could use to fix the mangled mess that was once his torso. John collapsed onto the floor, content to let his body slowly knit itself back together, regretting his life choices even as a Catman drenched in his blood broke out of her stupor and rushed to help him, swearing eternal fealty for his selfless act of heroic self-harm. Just kidding. She ran away without looking back. A very reasonable decision, but still a major low blow. He lay still for 5 seconds after Selena vanished, her boots fading into silence. That was all he needed. 5 seconds for his organs to stop twitching. 5 seconds for the meat of his heart to stitch itself together, beat by struggling beat. The first breath back was shallow. The second, cleaner. The third, fire. His eyes flared red. The old kind. Not the glow he wore as a costume to scare the crooks and keep them guessing, but something deeper, something hungry. His carelessness and masochistic decisions were on him, but someone else was involved in this mess. Someone had pulled the trigger. Someone tried to end him again. He rolled onto his hands, coughed once, then stood. The hole in his chest steamed faintly as the crushed bullet was expelled before finally closing. Another breath, and the surrounding blood was firmly under his control, returning to him and seeping through his skin. Whether it was to quench the rousing hunger or just to make the shooter's day a little bit worse, even John didn't know. The self-styled Alucard exhaled once, forcing his body into calm, and only then realized he had become a literal crimson bastard. Neat. He allowed himself a huff, then started thinking. The shot hadn't come from the next building. It had come from farther. Much farther. High-powered, insanely precise, and based on the kind of technological dumb shittery that made his own Earth's top militaries look like kids playing with firecrackers. It was a nightmare in the hands of rank-and-file soldiers, but when it's a professional, you get results like a well-fed vampire's body turning into modern art. A shot like this was rather insane, though he would appreciate it more if he weren't the target. It also means that the poor bastard knows he shot true and thus knows that I am dead. John smirked, cracking his neck in anticipation. He's packing up right now, ready to leave the area and receive his payment. He crouched, then jumped through what was left of the wall, landing on a lamppost and using it to get onto a rooftop. After months of using his ever-growing strength, speed, and inhuman physiology to run around his little piece of Gotham, breaking bones and taking names, moving across the rooftops at neck-breaking speeds became almost mundane. In only a few seconds, he reached an acceptable vantage point to take a look at his would-be predator, soon-to-be prey. A man clad head to toe in cutting-edge tactical armor, carrying enough firearms to start a small war, was quite a sight. But what truly caught John's attention, enough to make him stop picturing how he would slowly dismember that utter prick, was the two strange gauntlets with barrels. Utterly impractical weapons only usable by someone well-versed in bullshit marksmanship. And even then, his helmet had some advanced aiming tech built in. Deadshot, an individual known in the streets as a Day of the Jackal kind of bastard. Also one of the best and most expensive hitmen you could hire without tapping into some truly obscure circles. It was truly a pity. John had some half-formed plans about employing him later on when his influence grew beyond a single city, but meeting so soon, and in such circumstances, a shame, really having to turn a talented family man into a statement. But such was life. Pain wasn't new to John Harker. He knew it in ways humans could hardly fathom, but tonight he was happy to try and teach them all about it. Who knows? He might even try something new. The job was quick and easy. This was bad news. As soon as the first half of the payment was received, Floyd Lawton showed up right at the agreed-upon time, double-checked that Batman was still busy laying down the law on whatever nonsense the clown got up to, then checked it once more to be sure before suiting up. Deadshot got burned too many times to start shitting on the Bat's porch, so it was now his policy to only do so when bigger issues were occupying his time, and even then, only target assholes or people so strong they were no longer exactly civilians. That's already more moral than the U.S. Army. From what he could see, this Alucard was neither and thus fair game. So he made a plan, backup plans, and escape routes. Started tailing the pussycat until she caught the newest freak show in Freak City. Lined up the shot, and took down the bastard with the latest mess you can eat LexCorp's arms division came up with. Alucard went down and stayed down. Just like that, there was no need to use the turrets he set up on the other side of the building, call the hired muscles to distract him and damage him further, or regroup and start harassing him until he inevitably found an exploitable weakness and took the man down. The way you usually dealt with superhuman bastards. He called bullshit and made the executive decision to pack up and leave the area before his life choices came back to bite him. If the so-called monster were dead and he was just being paranoid, he'd get the rest of the payment. If he survived and instead had something devious planned out, then he'd be happy to send his down payment to Thorn or whoever his next of kin happened to be a few months later while sipping cocktails in Costa Rica and while he was sure the heat died down. Darn, Thorn really went all in, hiring both Catwoman and Deadshot for little old me. Someone spoke way too calmly. His visor made it so he didn't need to turn around to see the one who talked, the figure with bright red eyes and, more alarmingly, without a huge hole in their torso. The man got hit with an anti-material sniper rifle, and all he got was torn clothes. That's when Deadshot knew he messed up. Well shit, Floyd muttered. Indeed. The very much alive man said calmly, sounding amused, as if he were entertaining some kids instead of getting shot in the vitals by the world's greatest marksman. Deadshot just stood there for a second, looking at the man in a fancy suit he just tried to kill, his mind racing to try and find a way out of the situation. If he survived shots from anti-material rifles, his wrist-mounted guns would barely tickle him, and his assault rifle would take him at least 1.5 seconds to pull out and fire, which was ample time for Alucard to turn his insides into outsides. Stab him? Please, as if that would work. There was only one thing left to do, negotiate, and hope he could somehow talk his way out of this. Talk his way out of an attempted murder. Shit, he was screwed. Yes, you are quite thoroughly screwed. Alucard nodded empathically. Did he say that out loud? He didn't. He knew he didn't. Wait, can this monster also read minds? He called bullshit. That's way too much in one package. No, I can't read minds, Alucard said, shaking his head, which didn't exactly help his case. You're just rather expressive. He wore a full face mask, which makes it all the more surprising. Alucard smiled, which would be pretty darn disarming if not for the fangs and glowing red eyes. Did he mention the non-existent hole in his chest? Well, it is a pretty big deal. Alright, he had to stay calm and try to figure things out. At least the monster didn't seem all that bloodthirsty for the moment, especially given the whole shooting him business. You should be dead, he said, then immediately cringed. Was he subconsciously suicidal? He had to be. Why else would his darn mouth try to get him killed? Somehow, it only seemed to amuse the man further, which was a pain in his books. Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Alucard grinned. Floyd would rather he stop doing that but was happy to let him keep going since it would likely result in his death. He also didn't point out that there were no rumors. He personally fired the bullet straight into his surprisingly low heat signature, which he might have missed if not for the way Catwoman was looking at him. He didn't know whether it was some superpower or tech, but he really wanted whatever the heck Alucard used to spoof detection, which could really save his life. But it was neither here nor there. For now, he had to focus on not getting ripped to shreds. Step 1, try to point the scary guy at someone else, preferably someone he didn't like. Such as the schmuck who hired him to murk this abomination without telling him he should have brought a missile launcher. Something could be said about professionals not throwing clients under the bus, but that was for living professionals. He'd rather get to see his daughter one more time than play the tough guy for some fat cat who'd happily sell him for half a sandwich and some Kool-Aid. Listen, it wasn't personal, he said, swallowing his pride and thinking about his princess. That was the only way he could tolerate the fact that he was essentially pleading right now. I'm a contract killer. Rupert Thorne is the one who wants you dead. Yeah, let it be known that the great Deadshot was absolutely shit at diplomacy. He could just picture himself getting thrown off the rooftop and turned into a stain on the pavement. In a city like Gotham, odds were that his corpse would be left to rot for days on end. Joy. At least the monster was having fun. His smile widened, making him a lot more unsettling, though. He looked as if he just figured out something hilarious, as if he were planning a big prank instead of the best way to dispatch him with extreme prejudice. Was that a good thing? He had no freaking clue. That he does, Alucard chuckled merrily. And Floyd was learning many things about scaring stone-cold killers shitless. But you were the one who tried to murder me. What should we do about that? Not kill me, Deadshot wanted to say, and preferably let me go unmolested and unarrested. But no way that would happen. Then his eyes widened under his mask as his brain somehow managed to stop trying to get him killed or convince him that suicide was preferable to another minute standing in front of the abomination known as Alucard. Instead, it came up with something daring, morally dubious, somewhat honorable, and very much illegal. Something that was crazy enough to work. As he gathered his courage and pitched it to the monster, for what else could you call a man with razor-sharp fangs, eyes of the most vibrant scarlet that seemed to glow in the darkness of night, and the kind of power that no amount of guns and precision could overcome? The monster's smile faded, and he looked at him searchingly until he found what he was looking for and decided it was worth something more than the satisfaction of crushing his bones. Hopefully, it would work well enough to keep him alive long enough to leave this hellhole of a city. Deadshot had a policy against doing business in the Batman's yard. Now he added a rule to do his level best to never again enter this monster's sight. But for now, he had a job to do. It would be neither quick nor easy. This was good news. Presence 1. Awe. Awe is simple but solid. Once the vampire employs this power, those who are near him or her either want to be closer to him or her or shudder in fear. It is an immediate and intense attraction but temporal and not so overpowering that those afflicted lose their sense of self-preservation. Danger breaks the spell of fascination, as does leaving the area. Victims will remember how they felt, though, and this will affect their reactions should they ever encounter the vampire again. Awe is extremely useful in mass communication. It does not matter what is said. The hearts of those affected will lean towards the user's opinion or know not to provoke him. Vampire rule number 33. It is the duty of a vampire to act smug while making use of assets both unwilling and unaware, even those you didn't plan for. To live in Gotham is to learn how to silence that little voice in your head that tells you that you should care, lest you end up battered in her streets. That was one lesson Selina Kyle learned quick. Despite not being the best student in the 1.5 years she spent in the school system, before things went from bad to worse and then just stayed horrible. Before she had to choose between selling her body to earn her next meal or learn how to pluck her next dollar from someone else's pocket. Both options would result in frequent beatings, constant spite, and a perpetually uncertain future. Only one of them would let her look into the mirror. The choice was quickly made and never regretted. In the end, she could live with bruises, deal with the consequences of her craft, and be content with making the most of her present if a better tomorrow was indeed out of reach. But self-loathing, that stuck to you like the Joker on Batman's booty, or Harley on the Joker's booty. She wasn't sure which image was the most horrifying and funny. But she couldn't really appreciate the full extent of her twisted mind or find some friend she hadn't yet burned who was willing to listen to her humor. Because somehow, taking a straightforward tracking and breaking in job ended with her having to deal with that blight again. Self-loathing. So much of it, in fact, that she was having a hard time silencing that little voice in her head. That was all she could feel once her legs stopped moving on her own and her mind was capable of producing something other than panic and escape plans when she realized she wasn't in that safe house anymore, that she was no longer in danger, that there was no broken, bloody body in front of her. Oh, so that's how it is. She got a bit carried away and, in hindsight, should really have known better than to take a job involving another masked vigilante's secret identity. Taking said job right in the middle of the streets also didn't help. However, she wasn't known for her powerful sense of self-control, nor did she have a history of good decision-making, so that was something to be expected. She got double-crossed, which was again something she completely expected. Her line of work and the nature of her employers meant that things like loyalty and integrity meant damn all in the face of greater profits. She got someone killed. Okay, now that wasn't something she expected, but this was Gotham City, and there was that. Said person got shot taking a bullet for her. This was starting to sting a little bit. That foolish, stupid, utterly brainless savior of hers also just happened to be her current target. Yeah, that was the part that made her feel like someone seized all her fairly stolen money, burned it, and then scattered the ashes in the ocean, all the while stealing lollipops from babies and shooting kittens. And that person was her. Running away without looking back while that complete moron was bleeding to death probably didn't help. Little voice in her head supplied, which was utter nonsense. That was the only good decision in that situation. What was she even supposed to do for the man whose torso got nearly blown to smithereens? She even had bits of his blood in her mouth. It tasted oddly good for some reason, but might have also been ash for all the good it did. She did the smart thing, making the choices that would let her live another day, the one that didn't involve getting shot because of feelings. So what if he died alone? This was Gotham. Dying alone was literally leagues better than some alternatives. He was the one who decided to take that bullet. It didn't mean he was entitled to seeing her hold his bloodied hand and cry in gratitude. It wasn't her fault. She didn't kill him. She wasn't even really the one who got him killed or wanted to know who he truly was, despite him not bothering to put on a mask anyway. It was Thorne. It was all his fault. Rupert Thorne. She gritted her teeth, feeling all that hatred stop drowning her now that it had a more convenient target. All those confusing emotions were given structure and direction through the nearly irrational contempt she felt for that traitorous pig. He was the one who killed him, after all. It was his fault she felt this way. He tried to kill her. She was just the distraction. The plan wasn't to unmask Alucard. He killed him. Self-loathing, hatred, sadness. Everything took a back seat as cold fury took over. Emotions numb to let her devious mind find the best ways to cause him pain. He would pay, and then it would all be better. And then maybe she could forget that resigned smile as a bullet pierced his chest, destroying his body, instead of ending her life. It wasn't her fault. She wasn't the strongest woman out there, nor the most martially skilled, and certainly not the most intelligent. But when it came to stealing, she was the very best. For people like Thorne, who gave up everything in the pursuit of wealth, she was their worst nightmare. He just didn't know it yet. There was nothing she felt tracking down Rupert Thorne, and she felt nothing more breaking into his private residence in the county, sneaking past armed guards and security measures that were just barely legal. One of the issues of being a public figure and wanting to be more marketable than Falcone was that he had less leeway when it came to the power he could leverage at home. The plan was simple and the execution flawless, the kind of tomfoolery she often did for fun. Break into his safes and take everything she could, destroy what she couldn't, and collect proof of his misdeeds to leverage in a court of law for when she inevitably slips up and gets caught. The basics, unlike trying to uncover a known superhuman's identity, it still felt a little lacking compared to Thorne's actions. Perhaps she could go ahead and burn the whole mansion down? Millions of dollars in damages would be a nice way to start her vengeance. Alas, she had to leave Pyromania for another occasion. Hearing the arrival of a veritable convoy of vehicles while carrying such a wonderful haul of someone else's money had pretty much forced her to enact her exit plan. Only when she caught her ride back to the city and stashed her gains in a secure place before crashing into one of her more comfortable safe houses did she allow herself a satisfied smile, almost purring in wicked satisfaction. Schadenfreude, some would call it, or maybe the satisfaction of enacting financial vengeance upon one asshole of the highest order. Or maybe it was her kleptomania acting up. Yeah, it was probably kleptomania. She stretched and lay back upon an Italian sofa, one arm lazily reaching out for the remote, eager to put on some comfort show and maybe muster up enough willpower to get some ice cream involved in the evening. It was a scene capable of inducing pure horniness, but before she could have fun picturing people's reactions to her antics, she was interrupted by the sound of the news channel. Boring. I want to watch shitty reality shows and laugh at crazy people's lifestyles, she thought, only to be interrupted once more just as she was about to switch channels. This just in, multimillionaire and industry mogul Rupert Donald Thorne was shot tonight during a high-class dinner with associates. The journalist, Vicky Vale or something, a pretty blonde thing with bright eyes who had been making some waves lately, announced, doing a solid effort of masking her pleasure at the news, but Selena couldn't be fooled. Witnesses claimed seeing a dozen armed gunmen breaking into rooms and shooting the pleading lobbyist execution style, with some sources talking about organizations linked with the National Liberation Front of Corsica. Selena could only watch in disbelief as the camera showed the blurry images of a very much still body being pulled into an ambulance. The body of Rupert Thorne. The police, however, concluded that it was the act of a single shooter with a sniper rifle. The blonde continued, not being very considerate of Selena's mental breakdown. The reporter continued speaking, but the words mixed into incoherent sounds as she tried to wrap her head around the news, her new reality. How could she get her revenge on a dead man? Who could she blame for what happened? She really needed that ice cream now. Meanwhile, informants have managed to obtain live footage of Gotham's newest vigilante as he dismantled multiple drugs and prostitution rings through the East End. The police refused to comment and reiterated their commitment to stop deranged citizens from taking justice in their own hands. Vicky Vale spoke once more, and this time the words got through despite Catwoman's growing headache. To that, Selena could only do two things. First, she decided that she really didn't like Vicky Vale. And second, what the actual hell? She said slowly, looking at the blurry video footage of an inhumanly fast individual, one she saw dying with her own eyes. She would have called bullshit, but there was no mistaking those red eyes glowing in the dark. Shutting off the TV before Vicky Vale told her the United States started a war with Canada or whatever bullshit she decided would trouble her the most, Selena got up from her arse in an act of extreme effort, headed toward the freezer, and opened it harshly, only to be stopped in her tracks. She had run out of ice cream. Damn it! Vampire rule number 34. There is a time for hard work and a time for revelry, but even eternity isn't enough if you drown yourself in excess. Rupert Thorne was dead. Now that put a smile on John's face, even as he ignored Reginald's very loud and expletive-filled celebration at the demise of the man who brought them no small amount of problems in these already troubled nights. More than that, the criminally inclined investor and political contributor was killed while both John Harker and Alucard had alibis. One was seen leaving his personal car with his close friend and assistant Reginald Cousins and his socially inept bodyguard Larissa Diaz, then entering one of his solicitor's offices to settle a small legal problem. A solicitor who happened to be a rather charming lady with blood, a healthy diet, and a well-used gym membership, whose office just happened to have roof access from which you could sneak off undetected, but the woman would have to be left in quite a stupor to ignore something like that, the kind that came after some extreme pleasure, minor blood loss, and perhaps a one-word command to sleep. Nothing too invasive, just enough for a pleasant 3-hour nap. The other was caught by a quick-thinking passerby on his Wayne phone's camera during a busy night where he took down 3 of the largest gang operations in the East End, of which only one was affiliated with Thorne. Sparing Deadshot really was a good idea. He grinned, his eyes a pleasant blue while he enjoyed some medical blood packaged into juice boxes. A benefit of his work fixing the community, the young and healthy were encouraged to donate blood, and now that people actually felt safe and relatively content, they were more than happy to contribute. Not as good as getting it straight from the tap, but it was better than nothing, and ghoul or not, he wasn't about to exsanguinate Larissa because he felt peckish. There was already too much of that going on in the bedroom. He was starting to worry about her health. Speaking of Larissa, she was the only one of the 3 in a foul mood despite the good news. Seeing a now superhuman poisoner and martial artist frowning with such a murderous expression would have intimidated most people. But he knew that sanity was overrated, and thus John could only find her adorable. Tisk. She looked away, as if sensing the disrespect from her vampiric boss. I still think we should get rid of him, or people will think trying to kill you is fine, so long as they do you a favor later on. It was sound reasoning, but one she only used to justify her desire to put her fellow assassin 6 feet under, preferably in a slow and painful manner. The way she disregarded his orders to patrol his core territory in Brideshead and remain on standby to put out any fire, rushing by his side and all but forcing him to drink her blood until she almost fainted, spitting out insults and curses so harsh, he could almost feel a bunch of slippers being thrown to punish her potty mouth. It made him appreciate his kind-reformed assassin on a whole new level. Bubbles, however, was a true brother and just laughed his butt off at his insane boss who literally got shot by military-grade weaponry over pussy. Like a true man. He stopped laughing when Copperhead looked at him, though. Losing his crackhead status translated into a newly acquired sense of self-preservation and a righteous fear of crazy women who could and would inject him with enough toxins to make the freaking scarecrow raise an eyebrow. But that's fine. Nobody's perfect. That would be a problem, he conceded, mollifying his current most combative asset. But it should be offset by the credibility gained after scaring a top killer so thoroughly, he ended up killing his own client for essentially setting him up to fail. It was all in the game. The amount of respect lost from such mercy was less than what he gained, making Floyd not only fail his contract but also murder a client. It had to be considered. A hired gun had to be reliable, so making him sacrifice that was a powerful move for all parties involved. Deadshot's reputation and Thorne's own status would thus fuel his own mythos, something that would compound with each appearance, each attack against Gotham's underbelly, and each day he leveraged his growing influence over the media to force the police to acknowledge his existence and, therefore, admit their inability to stop him. With time and a couple major moves, Alucard would officially be known as one scary monster, a beast worthy of Gotham. But that was future John's concern. Once he consolidated after the end of the war against Rupert Thorne, permanently neutralized his now destabilized and already fragmenting outfit, started working on the economic side of things, and more importantly, celebrate the death of the man who caused his death. It felt so long ago, when a clueless and frail John Harker walked these streets so aimlessly, the streets he now claimed as his own domain. A domain he built up from a drug-infested slum into a safe, united community with growing wealth, plentiful opportunities, and a bright future, brick by brick. Uplifting criminals into honest workers, systemic victims into protectors, drug addicts into respected leaders of the community, self-sabotaging waitresses into prosperous business owners, expendable cartel enforcers into immortal bodyguards, all in a matter of months, as he himself grew from an arrogant whelp led around by some interface into a vampire aware of his own power. Yesterday, Brideshead became his. Tonight, the East End was conquered. Tomorrow it shall be all of Gotham, the whole nation, perhaps even the world, because one day he would become a true no-life king. And it all started with one very bad day. Now there are truly no witnesses, Thorne. Vampire rule number 36. You might have all the time in the world, but sometimes it still won't be enough. When sophisticated criminal networks encroach on an area, their primary function is perpetual expansion and growth regardless of the consequences, the very same behavior as cancerous cells. John couldn't really see it during his first nights, what with him being more concerned with how he could carve his own place in this new world, the new perspective and mental changes brought by his condition, and trying not to notice every disgusting act in the general area. He didn't really think about how utterly sad it was to see children peddling hard drugs in the streets while their own parents were out stealing, whoring, and conning their way into $10 so that they may afford their high. Or, if they were lucky, rotting in Blackgate until the latest breakout, early release due to overcrowding, or the patronage of some politically gifted benefactor. But now that he spent so much time, sweat, and literal blood to conquer, then salvage it into a viable domain, he felt it thoroughly. It was in every economic report that arrived on his desk, each compiled results of profits, costs, and overhead. lowered prosperity, dwindling confidence, and a slow but steady erosion of morals and community he and his people painstakingly cultivated. No, he won't comment on the irony of a vampire spreading virtues. Bubbles already did plenty of that. But more than anything a spreadsheet could convey, it was during his nightly walks that he could truly see the high degree of damage done and the continuous efforts to repair and rise above it all. When he passed by businesses he owned in part or in whole, he saw defaced facades and broken windows because of yet another robbery. When he crossed the streets and smelled broken vials freshly thrown down the gutter, doubtlessly the work of neighborhood watch and concerned citizens with a Glock, a baseball bat, and a solid 30 years of Gotham-induced rage. When people looked at the lone figure wandering around, they watched warily before realizing it was sweet Johnny Blue Eyes instead of some crook looking for a quick buck or just to make an honest man's life worse. They smiled and joked with him, trying to rope him into sharing a drink, a meal, or anything more than a few moments of pleasantries and inquiries. But he could see that the war had taken its toll. A price he did his best to pay by himself, both through the freshly established Harker Foundation and its economic activities and his and Copperhead's work eliminating the remnants of Thorne's outfits and whatever foolish gangbanger thought they could move in any way. Stash houses were raided, bones broken, and so much money, drugs, and weapons seized that he could easily run his own private army at this point. However, this was the modern era and not the age of sword and cavalry, and while being a warlord truly was a man's romance, it wasn't meant to be. Probably. What he could do was launder the money through his ventures, then re-inject it straight back into the community's veins, employ affiliated renovators and construction crews to repair the damages, push the paperwork to allow the demolition of the unlivable slums, defunct low-rises and crack dens, and build back more housing. Expand into the whole East End, both by blood and money, now that the big-ish fish around are dead and the other major crews are stuck in a feeding frenzy, devouring Thorne's assets in prime territories. Cuts of the highly profitable territory in downtown, the Diamond District, and the docks were now the theater of a growing gang war as Falcone, the Sicilians, and whoever had enough balls to contest them devoured the juicy carcass that was Rupert Thorne's lifework. Well, it might become a gang war. Now it was just huge monsters gobbling up a fractured crew too disorganized to truly defend their own booty. Honestly, at this point, the Roman might very well send him a thank you letter for his generous contribution. Well, it's not like I can afford to expand right now, John sighed, stepping into a familiar alley near Brideshead. The one where a young man once had a horrible day. I'm already stretched thin trying to hold on to the East End, and that's with us leaving Park Row alone for the moment. It was a hard decision, accepting that he couldn't truly take the territory in full, but Crime Alley wasn't like the other economically deprived, collectively traumatized, potentially cursed neighborhoods. It was a den for the crazies, those out to carve people up and not much else. Not something he could fix with some money and a winning smile, so the tried and true Alucard/Harker combo wouldn't work there. All he could do was show up every once in a while to break some faces and make it clear that violence spilling out of that cesspool wouldn't be tolerated. I guess that's how Gordon feels trying to deal with Gotham. He couldn't help but smile. There was simply too much work and too little time. He couldn't even truly look at those government spooks running around the city as of late or try to make a more intricate game plan to deal with the Bat beyond the Helsing Gambit and guilt-tripping Catwoman, which was crazy enough to work in his humble opinion. He knew the Bat would start looking into him, and he sure as hell was going to find his hideouts, see Selina's thieving paws all over them, and interrogate her about the new kid in town until he could profile him perfectly. Even his feeding habits were taking a back seat as he drowned in endless work, taking down the more organized and well-armed crews, showing his face in public to maintain morale and his civilian cover, and keeping tabs on major players who might be tempted by the increasingly prosperous East End, both criminals and, worse, investors. Those were the real vampires. But it could be worse. At least the Joker and most of the freak shows are tucked neatly into the asylum, and most of the masked criminals are still acting more or less civilized. For a bunch of murderous outlaws, that is. Better yet, he had a date with a busted brunette with a penchant for jokes that would leave him cancelled, sued, and utterly despised by all political parties if the media caught a whiff of her. Hilarious nonsense. He even managed to get his paperwork, fieldwork, and token public appearance done 1 hour earlier than anticipated, just so they could enjoy themselves without interruption. Because bloody hell, after all this nonsense, he deserved those cuddles. Alas, all his wonderful plans were about to crash against a wall. Vampire rule number 37. Vampires can't eat AIs. This is a petition by the Bloodsuckers against Clankers Association. Please stop posting generic slop that pollutes the writing platforms or just stealing stories by the dozen. There was something to be said about the simple pleasures in life, the way they made all the hardships feel pleasant in hindsight and made you feel like it was worth the pain. Things like the earthy smell after it rains, playing around with bubble wrap like a little kid, enjoying a hearty dinner after a painfully long day, or watching a cat shove itself into a very small box. Things like eating a pure chocolate parfait while listening to a pretty woman talk about her day, knowing full well that a fellow undead somewhere out there in the multiverse was probably brooding about vampirism making life horrible. To him, John says only one thing: skill issue. He closed his eyes after a spoonful of cold, chocolatey goodness. They just had to get good and maybe stop glittering. So this woman comes in, and I could tell just by her haircut that she was trouble. She had that unhot soccer mom feel, the one that says she gets wasted on the daily but isn't drunk because wine doesn't count, Max said, enjoying her own Neapolitan ice cream, for her good taste was as potent as her back pains. They were being a bit louder than what's considered polite in public, doubly so in an establishment like this, the kind of mildly fancy vintage store trying to bring back ice cream parlors into fashion in a city suffering from heavy corporatizations of goods and services. It should have been a dud, but ended up bringing its own loyal upper-middle class and hipstery crowd. Anyone else would have gotten some rather harsh looks, but prolific investments and 0% loans were a gateway to abilities some might consider unnatural. Money talks, but it also lets you talk, apparently. The one that says she wants to talk to the manager? He asked, still savoring the slightly bitter aroma of dark chocolate. Truly, the exploitative companies outdid themselves. Nah, the one that says she's going to call the regional director and that she would make you lose your job, your girlfriend, and your dog if you don't apologize, refund, and perform ritual Japanese suicide on live TV. She said without blinking, pointing the spoon at him. That's very specific. He raised an eyebrow and enjoyed the way she smirked, something between amusement and pyromania. Freaking chaos gremlin that woman was sometimes. It was pretty much part of her very being. It seeped into her words, behavior, hand gestures, and expressions all the way down to her clothing choices. That leather jacket and jeans combo pretty much screamed instigation. It also happened to mirror one of his regular outfits. These two facts were completely unrelated, and John Harker was in no way deliberately provocative or conflict-seeking. To claim otherwise would lead to legal repercussions for defamation, slander, and libel. Because that's exactly what she said, right after driving the little princess nuts for 5 minutes straight, asking so many questions but not buying anything. She huffed, crossing her arms, which led to interesting results. And how did she go from nitpicking to demanding seppuku from a bakery's employee? He grinned. Well, she didn't phrase it that way, Max drawled, tapping her spoon on the glass. But it was in the subtext handsome. A woman can sense those things. Aha. He kept looking at her until she decided he somehow earned the right to the good parts of the story. I might have told her that if she was so concerned about her health, she could just head right over to the farmer's market, pick a large cucumber, and feed it to her starved little kitten. It might help her relax a bit, she said slowly and nonchalantly, as if she were discussing the weather. There were many possible reactions to that particular string of words, spoken with little regard for the time and place or the sensibilities of the approaching waitress bringing yet another serving of delicious, diabetes-inducing desserts. He could laugh. He could one-up her. He could escalate the action. What he didn't want to do was likewise rather obvious. He didn't want to mention his own dealings with starved kittens or serpents for that matter. He didn't want her to stop having a good time. and he absolutely didn't want to be interrupted by his phone ringing, despite making it clear that he was unavailable and should only ever be disturbed if Gotham was about to burn down. "Excuse me." He smiled apologetically and pulled out the good old Nokia, because no amount of jailbreaking could make him comfortable using a Wayne phone or, worse, a spyware-addled Lex phone. Max only shrugged and busied herself with the good food. "What happened?" he asked, fully prepared to unleash a tongue-lashing of massive proportions if the answer was lacking. Unfortunately, the answer was not lacking. "Sorry, boss." It was Reginald who called from the bunkered, legally non-existent office in Brideshead according to the number, which meant this wasn't regular Harker business, but something that required his special touch. "But we've got a code black." If he were alive, these words would probably make his heart skip a beat. Code black. Oh, so that's how it is. In true accordance with racial discrimination, Code Black was the worst possible situation they could currently manage with their current resources, the level above it not being subject to any color but a much more striking "we're effed and probably gonna die." There were plenty of things that could bring that level of calamity. Despite his growing strength, anything from alien incursions to stronger-than-average mages could and would ruin everything he built if given the chance. Code Black's comparison was much tamer, only amounting to that damage a modern army could inflict upon John and his domain. Such sweet and wonderful things as the murderous attention of ancient assassins, the gaze of the flying man in blue who somehow got past both the ever-present lead in Gotham and the sound pollution of nearly constant violent crimes and abuses. Or nukes. "Explain," he asked calmly, yet in a way that allowed neither delay nor deceit. Dumbledore could take pointers. In the time it took for Max to savor another unworried spoonful of tasty chocolate stolen from his own cup, the time it took for Bubbles to gather his words, all the while doubtlessly preparing himself for incoming orders, John's mind raced with possibilities and their solutions, most of which involved him doing a massacre to harvest the highest amount of blood possible, forcefully evolving into a higher breed of vampire, and then sharing a thorough and very enthusiastic walk with those responsible for ruining his plans, carefully built reputation, and the safety of his domain. Flipping a chessboard he set up so masterfully was not ideal. Giving up on precious assets and relationships was horrible. Sacrificing quality for quantity was unacceptable. Unfortunately, there are times when a man's efforts avail him no good choice, only some less wretched than the others. In the end, it all depends on the catastrophe at hand. There is a mass breakout in Arkham. The entire Freaks Gallery along with the super morons who broke them out are duking it out with the Bats and GCPD. Bubbles said, his voice carrying that one emotion between exasperation and horror that was so uniquely Gotham's. "It gets worse. The Joker somehow managed to smuggle a dirty bomb right under Batman's nose. Right there in the asylum. That's simultaneously better and worse than what I expected," he answered, closing his eyes as he contemplated the best possible courses of action, the path that balances risk and reward. In any case, it's probably too late to do any large-scale evacuation. I'll be joining you right away. Have Larissa and a ride on a standby, then prioritize your own safety and that of our necessary personnel. First, he needed to establish the facts. The villains were making a break for it. A group of metahumans caused the breakout. The Joker had a nuke. His little finger is telling that the uncomfortable amount of government spooks lurking around the city was due to this particular dumpster fire. It could therefore be assumed that there is a link between the oh-so-secret operation that was noticed by literally every player in town and the utter foolishness of a group of enhanced individuals trying to break into the asylum to let freak shows out. People didn't rescue friends from Arkham, largely because these people don't have friends. The closest thing was some large scheme from the Joker, which amounts to causing untold damages and making Batsy have another bout of depression. Now, he only knew of one government shitstain so skilled at catastrophic incompetence that they could fumble the bag to this extent. The obese whale herself, one of the people whose blood he would never consume even if he were literally starving to death, a title only shared by the Joker, Harley Quinn, and Jeffrey Epstein. Amanda Waller, or in this case, yet another obstacle on the path to victory. Looking back at Max, who was doing a very poor job of acting like she didn't sense that something was wrong, he made a quick decision. "I'm sorry, but it seems like we must cut things short." He pulled a few bills and put them on the table while the young woman looked at him in a way that would make the average Chinese protagonist reject her for courting death. "The Joker's breaking out of the asylum. You'll be going on a ride up to the country just in case. I'll join you as soon as I'm certain my folks won't end up poisoned to death." And just like that, the anger and dissatisfaction were gone, leaving behind only the concern and hesitation of a woman who spent years in this diseased city. A woman who knew nothing she could do or say would stop him from doing what he must. A woman who would worry despite knowing he was safer than anyone in Gotham by virtue of his strength alone. In the end, Max could only aggressively gulp down a comical amount of food before sighing with as much contentment as resignation. "Just try to stay safe, okay?" She smiled at him, and he once more noted that he truly didn't deserve her affections. "But he'll take it regardless." "I will." Unfortunately for a lot of people, him staying safe meant causing vast amounts of physical and psychological trauma upon their sorry asses. Vampire rule number 38. Business is pleasure of its own. John watched the black sedan driving away with his date inside, aware of the time-sensitive nature of the night's crisis, yet somewhat unwilling to let the good times end so soon. It had been a while since he'd had some harmless fun. Alas, such was life, or unlife in this case. Max would be away from the city and the bulk of the risk in a timely fashion. Bubbles would likewise bunker up with a core of collaborators and resources, all of which was guarded by Larissa and the ragtag band of civilians he hoped to one day shape into a proper security detail. With the true center of his operations, the people and wealth, as secure as they could be, he was now able to act without fearing an attack that might truly hurt him. Contingency truly is such a wonderful word. He grinned and felt his fangs growing in anticipation for tonight's mayhem and the bounty he might obtain. The situation still wasn't perfect. It never could be. There was always some factor preventing him from securing the perfect outcomes. It was also an unchangeable aspect of the human or vampiric condition. "I lack competent yet expandable manpower to take greater risks or stretch my actions further without losing control." The ability to obtain reliable intel beyond the happenings on the streets, as well as any sort of technological sophistication or esoteric alternatives. He noted as he started walking calmly down the street into a poorly lit alley, a feature of the city that had some serious impacts on the crime rate and the percentage of traumatized orphans. These were only the more obvious weaknesses, and those not innate to his nature, the blood requirement, weaknesses to fire and sunlight, or the drive to seek out further growth and evolution were another can of worms entirely. Of these flaws, the only one he could truly overcome at the moment was the lack of combat-ready assets. Everything else was sadly beyond him. He might be a smart cookie, but the ability to dismantle criminal organizations, enact social engineering operations, and adapt to extremely hostile environments didn't translate into skills as a programmer, web development whiz, hardware expert, or the favorite of the internet community. The ability to blitz through all current tech limitations and create a more or less sentient AI that will surely not go Skynet on his unliving, sorry self. Recruiting people who could be was also a hurdle, given that all businesses, individuals, and small companies he controlled were firmly blue-collar, only requiring willing labor and hands-on training. It was a disadvantage of his starting area and available workers, but he was pretty sure he ended up turning that bug into a feature, since it synergized well with his attempt at uplifting the masses. However, it made the prospect of incorporating techies into the whole system very daunting, let alone leverage their work for his other line of work. As for magic, he would rather become a therapist for every Karen in the States than try and approach someone who might get John Constantine involved in any way, shape, or form. No offense to him, he did have a very nice name, but he'd rather cuddle Harley than shake his hand. In fact, he'd rather stop thinking about the man before something went wrong. Dealing with the Joker and his nuke was much safer, even with all the problems he laid out. Some people might not tolerate such a brutal dismantling of their abilities, but those people usually ended up dying stupidly, so he'd rather stay honest with himself. That way he could find solutions instead of exploring the depths of his own anal cavity. Don't have the ability to materialize a combat outfit out of a ring or have it delivered right away by stealth plane. No problem. What he did have was a very respectable top speed, a near-perfect knowledge of his streets, and a whole bunch of loyal former crackheads who spent years homeless in Gotham of all places and thus accumulated a number of safe places to hide their stuff or themselves when the going was tough. Places he was shown and could blitz to with a glee and happiness that would make Edward Cullen turn in his sadly non-existent grave if he learned a vampire had the audacity to enjoy supernatural speed and grace. He could then change his clothes and apply the proper makeup to look less like the cover of borderline abusive young CEO romance novels for single women in their 30s and more like the borderline abusive fantasy love interest who dresses like it's the Victorian era despite the story being set in the Middle Ages because the author had run out of FS to give, which involved a brand new scar, a bit of white in his hair, and a smile that would make many a Yandra proud. All of which took him about 3 minutes to get done. Not as good as using a spatial ring, which might or might not contain the ghost of a powerful ancestor, who might or might not bang depending on the amount of jade-like beauty involved, but it got the job done. And yes, it wasn't some top-tier armor capable of stopping anything from artillery rounds to Superman's I-beams, but at least it's waterproof. John's now blood-red eyes widened a bit as his rather disturbed mind took hold of something more dangerous and insidious than any magic Zatara could teach him and more persistent than the fangirls of an Uchiha. An idea. He took hold of it, studied it from many angles, conjured scenarios, and simulated possible deviations, planned for each possible variable and then a few of the impossible ones, only to smile as another 5 seconds were spent in the world of man, outside the machination of a truly mythical mind twice bolstered by celerity. It was very simple, a little bit stupid, and had a pretty good chance of making him curse his past self, but it was also just crazy enough to work. In short, the best kind of idea. Harvey Bullock hated his life. He wakes up every day in his dump of an apartment and tries to call his landlord to talk to him about the darn leaking faucet and what he thinks is a dead skunk on the floor above him that's making his own house unlivable. Now this was Gotham, so the skunk could also be the rotting carcass of some crackhead, squatter, or the landlord's cheating girlfriend. He wasn't going to try knocking on some doors or calling the cops because he was the cops, and he sure as hell wasn't about to give himself more work. He didn't make it so long living 12 miles up from hell by giving a damn when it wasn't his turn to give a damn. So he'll keep calling the landlord. Harvey will fail, curse plenty of people, places, and mothers, and then down half a bottle of whiskey with his shitty coffee. He won't move either because his job gets furloughed every 3 months and his credit score is only marginally better than that of the people he puts behind bars. Add in a rather extensive tab at 3 different police bars. Gambling his way into a losing streak, he'll no doubt expand before the month's over, and the misfortune of not being able to supplement his income like most cops because then Papa Gordon would be really disappointed. And nobody serving under the man wanted to disappoint Commissioner Jimbo, and that's only partly because of the colossal ass-whooping involved. Pity that's only 1/4 of the cops in the city. He grunted into his second donut of the day, holding it into his mind while getting dressed in the usual formal suit and trench coat combo that screams, "I'm murder police." His boasted more grease stains than most, but Detective Bullock was never afraid of getting a lil dirty. It comes with the home field. Then it's down the dirty stairways, walking past a newlyweds couple sucking tongue and doing his best to avoid a conversation with the elderly Mr. Wildbow from the second floor, who swears he saw a bunch of suspicious people creeping into the building. Said suspicious people were, of course, Dr. DeAndre and his family, who have been living here for nearly 3 years now. Mr. Wildbow had also been telling him this for nearly 3 years. Freaking Gotham. He squeezed himself into the seat of his beloved Chevy Cavalier, technically one of the department's rides, but he used it so often the clerks clocked it for him at this point and only asked that he sign the slips at the end of the month. Against the rules? Yeah, but when most of the people holding badges in this city were so rotten they shit maggots, nobody gives a damn. Not that many cops wanted one of these beauties either, mostly old heads like him who were set in their ways. The kids all vied for the new machines Wayne donated to the departments, probably as a thank you for the number of times they had to deal with his drunk arse. The new rides were sturdy but filled with all that tech and computer stuff he couldn't make heads or tails about. He'd much rather use something he understands and can pick apart and put back together if he ever needed it. Thank you very much. He drives his way out of his quaint little neighborhood stuck between the fringes of the East End, the Bowery, and freaking Little Russia. Last one wasn't called that, but there was so much vodka flowing through Locust Point it might as well be part of the Soviet Union. Probably the reason why I ended up with a pot belly and a beat-up liver, he thought, taking a bite out of the jelly-filled chocolate donut while driving. The third one of the day. He kept on driving till he reached Gotham Heights, an upper-middle-class district that looked like freaking downtown metropolis compared to his hometown. It also happened to be home to one of the 4 GCPD buildings in the city, and the one where you could find the most honest man in Gotham who had yet to go insane. Commissioner James Gordon ran the show after much trouble and plates of steaming shit being served to various people, in addition to a fair bit of, internal investigations which ended with the mother of all purges. He lived through it, watching the man's hair grow gray so fast it might count as a new superpower. Oh sorry, metahuman ability. Gotta use the technical words now, or the paper pushers get real angry. And Jim didn't need him giving those pencil grinders more reason to serve him new plates of shit. He and everyone in the department ate too much of it to even bear the thought of more. What with the absolute shit show that is Gotham's legislation, which might as well make it a vassal state rather than a proper city, had so many caveats it made Puerto Rico look fair and balanced and probably contributed to Harvey Dent losing his mind. There were technically 4 different commissioners, 2 police chiefs, and 8 deputies, and absolutely none of them equipped, willing, or able to do any real damage to the real players of the city's underbelly. Crooks who were, unlike them, equipped, willing, and very much able to turn the city into a war zone if only somebody lit a spark. Add in jurisdictions and territory repartitions that are utterly brainless, and you often need to bring in the commissioner himself to do anything meaningful. But hey, politicians say we're set to beat Metropolis on GDP, and our contribution to the stock market is larger than entire states put together, so it's all gonna be fine, I'm right. He chuckled as he passed by Larry, who once again got stuck on watch duty as a civilian. Might be a bit unfair, but the man just looked that forgettable, and someone had to make sure the department doesn't get surprise rated again. He didn't like the feeling of being held hostage by Calendar Man, of all people, who demanded they bring the mayor so that he could properly celebrate Guy Fawkes Day, or he'd blow up the whole building. He really didn't like having to wait for Batman to come and rescue them again. And he sure as hell nearly went medieval on the judge when they sent that psycho to the minimal security ward of Arkham Island. But that was then, and he didn't make enough money to afford thinking about yesterday's bullshit when a new load was about to be dumped on him. Nice and warm, just how Daddy likes them. He whistled some old tune as he parked his beauty into the lot and bid her farewell. It was a working man's song and thus sounded as jolly as possible with the most depressing lyrics available. He continued whistling as he nimbly avoided the grubby hands of his colleagues looking to steal a donut. Gotham's finest, ladies and gentlemen. He keeps evading all the way up to the 3rd floor, where uniforms disappeared and you started seeing the protectors of the law wearing suits in various states of disrepair. If you were insane enough to keep the job for years on end, you'd be able to tell how the cases were progressing based on their clothing alone. A cursory glance told him that nothing changed during the night shift. It was still a dumpster fire held together by absurd amounts of coffee and some creative stat recording. He expected nothing less. Bullocks then sits at his desk, looks at a mountain of paperwork, then at the whiteboard filled with red murder cases they have yet to solve but didn't work enough to give up and throw it at the bat, and then at old Bernie, who dragged a thug out of the interrogation room and was trying to convince him that the office copier was in fact a lie detector. Judging by how low the suspect wore his pants, Bernie would succeed. Harvey felt at home and thus utterly depressed. What followed was a mindless grind through 3 days' worth of paperwork, followed by something that made him miss the paperwork, right when his shift was about to end and the night shift people came to take over. A phone call on the 7th main line, the It's Messed Up line. The one that told the people supposed to investigate homicides that they now ought to stop whatever it was they were doing, grab their guns, and move their prestigious asses to start preventing homicides. Something that is both against regulation and causes panic. All hands on deck, red alert, all the shit just hit the biggest fan available. Gordon himself moves his arse out of the office as every person with a badge and a pair of balls was sent out to Arkham Island. News just came. The Joker was breaking out and it was getting very ugly very fast. Well, everyone was breaking out, but the Joker too, and that was way worse. Dozens of men move about with all the grace of pigs in a slaughterhouse, grabbing guns they seldom use out of their drawers, struggling to put on bulletproof vests over their guts, finding a ride and preparing themselves for the shit show. And since bad news never comes alone, the weather shifts into one of those very Gotham middle fingers, clouds stealing what little moonlight got past the towers and cloaking the city in darkness, and then came the downpour. Freaking amazing. They didn't get a full briefing until they all hopped into cars and wagons and were already halfway through that creepy island, and then Harvey wished they had never gotten briefed. Who the hell lets the Joker steal a damn nuke? He thought, feeling his stomach turn. Who the hell lets the Joker steal a freaking nuke? He asked his direct superior, and there was nothing Jim could do but grunt through his cigar as the driver did his best to make him drop it. Officially, the Joker manufactured a non-identified dirty bomb on his own while he was out of jail, with the help of a bunch of morons and Harley. The commissioner spoke every word in his media voice, the one he used to deliver bullshit to the news or when talking to politicians. Unofficially, the government messed up. No shit, they messed up. Bullock laughed. It was an ugly thing the ladies hated, but he didn't care about it right about now. For the second time in 3 months, he thought he was probably going to die. When they arrived on the island, getting past layers and layers of barges from the local police, reinforcement from the counties, and a good amount of fancy schmucks in black suits who really stood a bit too tall for being the shit stains responsible for this mess, he and his bunkies were greeted with the sight of a bloody war zone. Mobs of inmates, because there was no way in hell he'd call these schmucks patients, stormed the armored security guards, armed with nothing but pipes and stolen weapons from less fortunate men. They struck and threw all they had without regard for their own safety. Then came the freak shows. Dealing with a single monster like Bane or Ivy was a nightmare, but pretty much all of them at the same time. Give him a break. The commissioner made an attempt at getting the crowd to settle down, shooting promises through a megaphone, but everyone knew it was useless. They had to start shooting, start killing these pests. With some luck, maybe one of them will come face to face with the Joker and shoot the clown's head off. And if he saw a shadow come out of the water and start pummeling one of those freaks before it could tear into his colleagues, well, then he didn't see anything. His job was to deal with the criminal inside the asylum, after all. Harvey Bullock hated his life, but he only got the one. He'd be damned if he lost it to one of the worthless, witless, somewhat brainless serial murdering cuckoos in the asylum.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going. Plus, it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.